I woke to the faint creak of my RV shifting under the weight of the night, the kind of sound that makes you question whether it's the wind or something else entirely. My name is Derek, I'm 32, and I'd spent the last week on a solo road trip across South Dakota, tracing forgotten trails in my old Class C RV. But this night, in the Black Hills, the forest had a voice of its own, and it didn't feel like it wanted to be heard. It felt like it was watching. I'd come out here with my friend Marcus, a guy who was impossible to predict. Marcus had this mix of daring and recklessness, the kind that drew people in, but also left me perpetually on edge. He loved the isolation of camping, always seeking a spot far from anyone else. So when we rolled into the national forest that afternoon, winding down one of the narrower trails that the GPS reluctantly acknowledged, he grinned like a kid in a candy store, saying, "Nobody will find us here. Just pure forest, Derek. No rules, no one." The campground we chose was nearly abandoned. A cluster of gravel pads surrounded by towering ponderosas and the occasional wind-twisted juniper. Sunlight barely pierced the canopy, leaving the forest floor a dim mosaic of shadow and leaf litter. We parked, leveled the RV, and Marcus immediately wandered off, eager to explore, muttering about a secret clearing he'd seen on an old map online. I didn't argue. Part of me trusted him. Part of me wanted to make sure I wasn't about to watch him vanish into thin air. That night, after the fire crackled and the last orange light from the sun faded behind the hills, I noticed the forest sounds weren't quite right. Normally, nocturnal wildlife has a rhythm. An owl hoots, a raccoon rustles, a breeze whispers through the needles. But there was a repetition to it, subtle and unsettling, like someone or something was pacing in the shadows just beyond the tree line. I tried to laugh it off, telling myself Marcus was out there, probably scaring himself more than anyone, and that my mind was inventing patterns. But the closer the night pressed, the heavier the air became, as if the trees themselves were leaning in to eavesdrop. Marcus returned around 10, empty-handed, but his grin had changed. Not gone, but sharpened in a way that unsettled me. He recounted nothing particularly alarming, only that he'd explored a small trail and found a stream that cut through a hollow, a place no one would stumble across by accident. He was ecstatic, practically vibrating with energy, but he also seemed distracted, like he'd seen something that didn't want to be mentioned. I'd told him I'd go with him in the morning if he wanted to show me, but he brushed it off. "Nah, it's better if it stays our little secret," he said. That should have been my first warning, but I chalked it up to his usual love for mystery, his way of making the mundane magical. Sleep didn't come easily. The forest seemed to breathe around me, sighing in the gaps between the RV's mechanical hums. Somewhere, a branch snapped, not close enough to panic, not far enough to dismiss. I lay there imagining every worst-case scenario, telling myself that Marcus was fine, probably laughing alone somewhere, oblivious to my growing unease. By dawn, the forest was transformed. Mist hovered over the undergrowth, thin and rolling, giving everything a soft, unreal glow. I stretched, rubbed the sleep from my eyes, and stepped out of the RV to check on Marcus, and he wasn't there. I called his name, first softly, then with increasing panic. My voice bounced off the trunks, swallowed by fog. I knew he hadn't gone far. He was never one to disappear completely without a trace. I wandered along the gravel pads, scanning the hollow edges of the campground, the gaps between trees. Nothing, not a footprint, not a glimmer of his jacket, just the forest, indifferent and endless. Hours passed, each one heavier than the last. I eventually found his small backpack near the stream he had mentioned yesterday. It lay on the ground, a little muddy, straps twisted as if someone had dropped it in a hurry. But there was no Marcus, no note, no sign of struggle beyond the natural chaos of the woods, just a silence that gnawed at my chest. I radioed the park rangers, describing him, the RV, the location. They assured me they'd start a search, but their voices were calm, almost too calm, the kind that makes you feel like the forest has swallowed him before anyone could even blink. I spent the day combing trails, calling, listening, The wind shifted, carrying strange scents, damp earth, pine sap, and something metallic, faint but persistent. My stomach churned, and my mind refused to let me rationalize it. Something was off, wrong. Night returned, and with it the noises, amplified now. Repeated knocks, irregular, not in any pattern I could identify, echoing from deep in the woods. The RV felt claustrophobic, the mist pressing against the windows like icy fingers. Every shadow seemed alive, twitching, moving just beyond the edge of my vision. My phone had no service, and the forest felt like a trap, a living maze with invisible walls. I realized with a jolt that I was alone in a place where alone had a different meaning, a forest that didn't just host creatures, but seemed to have its own consciousness, its own agenda. I tried to sleep, curled up in the driver's seat, but every creak of the RV, every brush of leaves against the roof made my heart leap. Then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps outside, circling. Not slow, not hurried, just deliberate enough to be aware I was listening. I whispered Marcus's name, half in hope, half in terror. Silence. Then a soft tap at the RV door. I froze. My rational brain screamed to ignore it, to call for help, to remember that the Rangers were searching, that Marcus might be playing some cruel joke. But instinct clawed at me. Don't open it. I didn't. The tapping persisted, fading in and out, always from a slightly different spot. Eventually, it stopped. The forest returned to its rhythm, or what I could tolerate as rhythm, and I sat there until first light, exhausted, heart hammering, mind unraveling. When dawn finally broke, I ventured outside again. My backpack was gone. The tracks, Marcus's tracks, had vanished in the overnight mist. Every path I followed led me in circles. The forest had shifted, rearranged itself in ways that made no sense. By mid-morning, I was back at the RV, trying to gather my thoughts. I had a small map, a compass, but the terrain felt foreign, despite having walked it just yesterday. I realized then that Marcus had disappeared in a place where even time and distance seemed unreliable, where the forest wasn't just a backdrop, but a player, observing, influencing, feeding on fear. And in that realization, I understood something else. If Marcus didn't want to be found, no one would. But the forest had its own rules, and those rules didn't include kindness or explanation. I spent the next 2 days searching. I followed streams, called on every trail, listened for the faintest sound of a human voice. I left markers, notes, pieces of my own clothing in hopes he'd find them if he returned. But each night, the forest mocked me, noises that mimicked human movement, shadows that seemed to taunt my desperation. The Rangers finally pulled me out, their faces grave but resigned, offering the same calm assurances that did nothing to ease the gnawing sense that Marcus had become part of this place. Even now, months later, I drive the roads around the Black Hills, hoping to catch a glimpse of that familiar grin, that spark of recklessness, somewhere among the trees. And sometimes, when the wind shifts just right, I swear I hear him, or something calling my name from deep within the forest, reminding me that some places aren't meant to be tamed, some disappearances aren't meant to be understood, and that the fear we feel in the quietest moments of isolation is often the most real. The lesson, the painful truth I learned is this: trust your instincts, respect the forest, and never underestimate how easily the line between curiosity and danger can blur. Marcus taught me that in a way no one else could, leaving behind an absence that fills every shadow, every whisper of wind in the trees, and every lonely mile of gravel that leads into the unknown. Because sometimes even the closest friends vanish, not just from sight, but from the world we think we control, and all that remains is the story we tell ourselves to make sense of the silence. The days that followed Marcus's disappearance were a blur of fog and exhaustion, each one bleeding into the next with a disorienting sameness. I stayed in the RV, moving it only to the nearest pull-off along the forest road, telling myself I was waiting for a sign, waiting for him. I convinced myself that if I just stayed vigilant, if I just observed, something would reveal itself. But the forest had a way of erasing certainty. I remember one morning clearly. The mist had settled low, dense as wool, curling around the tires and wheels of the RV like ghostly tendrils. The world outside was muted, its colors reduced to shades of gray and green, the usual vibrancy of the Black Hills replaced by a heavy, oppressive stillness. I stepped out to breathe in the cold air, and my stomach flipped. Footprints. Not mine, not any I recognized from the ranger's tracks, but delicate impressions in the soft mud near the stream. Too small to be Marcus's, too precise to belong to an animal. They led away from the RV, disappearing beneath a copse of twisted trees where the sunlight couldn't reach. I followed them, despite every instinct screaming at me to stay put. The forest swallowed me quickly. The fog thickened, and every familiar landmark vanished within minutes. The air carried a sharp scent, iron like blood or rust, and it settled in my lungs, heavy and metallic. I tried to call out, but my voice seemed muffled, absorbed by the mist. The footprints led me to a hollow I had never noticed, a depression in the earth surrounded by pines that leaned inward like watchful sentinels. The silence here wasn't peaceful. It was deliberate, expectant. I reached the edge of the hollow and froze. Pressed against the bark of one of the pines was a scratch. Not deep, but intentional, a symbol that looked almost like a crude tally mark. And below it, faint but unmistakable, were scuff marks in the mud, as though someone had been dragged. My heart surged, my hands trembling, as I realized the forest wasn't just a backdrop. It was a participant, shaping events, influencing what happened here. Returning to the RV felt impossible. I kept walking in circles, my compass spinning inexplicably, the trail I had taken dissolving as if the forest had swallowed it whole. Each step amplified my unease. Twigs snapped behind me, leaves rustled where no breeze stirred, and the faintest whisper of a laugh, a human laugh, low and teasing, echoed just beyond the fog. I ran. My boots sank into wet soil, my hands scraped against branches, and I felt the forest pressing against me, almost alive, herding me back toward the hollow. I made it back eventually, collapsing inside the RV, drenched in sweat and mud. I tried to convince myself that I had imagined it, rationalizing everything as stress, grief, isolation, but deep down I knew better. Marcus hadn't simply wandered off. Something had claimed him, something that understood the forest in ways we never could. That night I barricaded the RV doors, double-checked the windows, and sat awake listening. Every creak, every drip of condensation from the roof felt amplified. And then the knocking began again. Not outside, but on the interior walls. Slow, irregular, deliberate. It wasn't random. It was communication, a pattern I couldn't decipher but could feel in my chest. My mind raced, trying to insist it was a branch, an animal, the old RV settling. But my instincts refused to listen. Sleep came fitfully, haunted by fragmented visions. Marcus's face emerging from the mist, twisting into a mask of terror, trees bending to form shapes that shouldn't exist, shadows moving against shadows. I woke repeatedly, each time certain the fog outside had thickened, that the forest was closer, watching, judging, waiting. By the third day, the forest felt like a labyrinth without an exit, a place where time and space no longer behaved reliably. I walked the trails, trying to mark them with sticks and stones, but each morning the markers were gone or rearranged. The same paths repeated endlessly, streams curved in impossible ways, and the sunlight never reached where it should. Panic bubbled beneath the surface, a tight coil of dread that left me shaking at even the smallest sounds. A bird call too close, a rustle in the leaves, the snap of a twig that sounded almost like a footstep. I realized then that the forest had become a mirror of my fear. It wasn't just hiding Marcus. It was shaping my perception, amplifying every doubt, every hesitation, every irrational thought until I couldn't trust my own senses. I tried calling for help again, but my radio picked up only static. The signal fragmented and distorted as though the trees themselves interfered. My phone had no service. The GPS spun uselessly, and the world outside seemed to exist only to trap me in a repeating nightmare. During one particularly long, disoriented trek, I stumbled across a clearing Marcus had described on the first day. Our secret stream, he had called it. But it wasn't what I remembered. The stream was narrower, the water darker, almost black, reflecting the twisted pines like a mirror warped with malice. And there, half submerged in mud, was a piece of Marcus's jacket, fresh, damp, but shredded in a way that suggested a struggle. And yet, there was no blood, no other signs of him. Just the jacket and the overwhelming sense that the forest itself had claimed him. I spent the afternoon following the stream, hoping for a clue, a sign, anything that could lead me to him. The forest closed in around me, trees bending unnaturally, roots curling into shapes that looked like hands grasping at my ankles, forcing me to stumble. Shadows stretched impossibly long in the late afternoon sun, and every sound, birds, insects, the wind, carried an unnatural cadence, like a chorus mocking my desperation. I returned to the RV that evening, exhausted, soaked, and terrified, realizing I had no plan and no path forward. I couldn't leave because I didn't know where the trails would take me, but staying meant facing the relentless, oppressive weight of the forest, every tree a silent witness to my failure. I barricaded the doors again and sat in the dark, listening to the creaks, the quiet scratching at the walls, the faint whisper of footsteps circling outside. Sleep was impossible. The forest had become both my prison and my tormentor. By the fourth day, I had begun speaking aloud to Marcus, calling his name, asking him to show himself, begging for any sign. And then it happened. A response. Not a voice, not a human sound, but a movement just beyond the RV in the mist. A shadow, tall and thin, moving with purpose, deliberate. My heart stopped. I grabbed the flashlight, shone it toward the movement, and it vanished. The mist swallowed it, leaving only the chill and the echo of something watching. I knew then that Marcus wasn't coming back in any conventional sense. The forest had taken him, folding him into its rhythm. And the lesson crystallized. The forest isn't just a setting. It's an active force, an entity that reacts to curiosity, intrusion, human recklessness. And if you underestimate it, you pay a price. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I stayed by the window, listening, watching, trying to convince myself that staying vigilant was the only way I might glimpse him, or at least understand what had happened. And deep into that night, I realized that my fear, my panic, my obsessive search, they had become part of the forest's design. They had ensnared me, just as they had ensnared Marcus. I knew I couldn't remain much longer. On the fifth day, I packed lightly and prepared to leave, but even leaving was a nightmare. The roads had shifted, the forest closing in on the paths I had driven without trouble before. Every turn seemed unfamiliar, every landmark distorted. The compass spun wildly. And all around me, the forest whispered, almost laughing as though aware of my panic. Driving out, I felt an ache that wasn't just for Marcus. It was for the forest itself, for the invisible rules I had broken, for the humbling truth that humans are not masters here. The Black Hills had marked me. The echo of Marcus's disappearance lingered in every shadow, every rustle of leaves, every curl of mist along the gravel. Even months later, I drive these roads searching for closure, walking trails cautiously, always alert to the forest's subtle signals, the skewed shadows, the unnatural rhythms, the whispers that brush against your mind when no one else is around. And though I haven't seen him, I feel him sometimes, just beyond the edge of perception. A warning, a reminder. Some curiosity carries a cost that cannot be measured in hours or days. Only in absence, silence, and the relentless pressure of something older and stranger than us. By the time I reached the sixth day, the forest had become more than a backdrop. It had taken on the presence of a predator, patient and deliberate, attuned to every movement, every thought, every pulse of fear in my chest. I had begun to notice patterns in the sounds, in the way shadows shifted, as if the trees themselves were rearranging to communicate, or to mock me. Every step I took was measured, cautious, yet the deeper I ventured, the more the forest seemed to tighten around me. Corridors of pine and underbrush bending inward, reducing space, warping reality. I tried not to think about Marcus, but it was impossible. His absence haunted me, pressing against my thoughts like a living thing. I kept replaying the last moments I saw him, The thrill in his eyes, the teasing grin as he vanished toward the stream, and the way he had warned me, half joking, to trust the forest, or else. That half joke now rang like a prophecy. The sunlight filtered in through a dense canopy, fractured into splintered beams that seemed to shimmer unnaturally. I followed a trail that I thought I recognized, my eyes scanning for his footprints, any sign, any clue. And then I saw it. A clearing I had never seen before, small, almost perfectly circular, with the earth scoured and bare, save for a single twisted pine stump in the center. The air here was heavier, damp and metallic, carrying the scent of iron mixed with the damp rot of leaves. My stomach churned. Something was wrong. The hairs on the back of my neck rose. I felt a presence behind me, not human, but aware, attentive. I spun, flashlight in hand, and caught nothing, just fog curling lazily through the trunks. But then I heard it, a low hum, almost imperceptible, vibrating through the ground beneath my boots. It wasn't natural, and it wasn't mechanical. It was deliberate. Attentive. A communication I couldn't decipher but could feel reverberating in my chest. I stepped toward the stump, each movement measured, cautious. My pulse thundered in my ears. And then I saw it. Small markings carved into the wood, jagged, deliberate. Symbols that made no sense to me but filled me with a deep, visceral dread. And there at the base, faint impressions in the mud like tiny footprints, delicate, uneven, leading into the dense trees beyond. They weren't human. Or if they were transformed, altered, part of whatever had taken Marcus. I wanted to leave, to run back to the RV, to call anyone, to scream into the emptiness, but my body froze. Some part of me, a darker, instinctive part, wanted to follow, wanted to see, wanted to confront the unknown. I knew it was dangerous, and yet I couldn't stop. The forest had me in its thrall, a slow, inexorable pull that warped rational thought. I moved forward, each step weighted with fear. The mist thickened, curling around me, muffling the usual forest sounds, leaving only an oppressive, expectant silence. Every tree seemed taller, its branches twisting in impossible angles, casting shadows that didn't match the shapes above. The forest was no longer just a place. It was a sentient labyrinth, aware of me, tracking me, shaping my perception. Hours or maybe minutes passed. Time lost meaning. The trail of footprints ended at the base of a hollow tree. Its bark gnarled, roots curling outward like the fingers of some ancient creature. I peered inside. Darkness. Absolute darkness. I felt compelled, drawn as if something inside beckoned me forward. My rational mind screamed to turn back, but my instinctual, desperate part whispered that this was where I might find him. I stepped closer. The air was thick, humid, carrying whispers I couldn't fully make out. Then a sound, soft, almost inaudible at first, like breath, human breath, but distorted, uneven, as if the forest itself was shaping it. I froze. Marcus? My voice cracked, fragile in the oppressive quiet. Silence. Then again, breath. Closer. And then a whisper. Chillingly clear. Don't. Follow. I stumbled back, heart hammering. The whisper wasn't in my head. It came from the hollow, vibrating in the very air, a warning or a plea. I wanted to obey, but fear and desperation collided in my chest. I felt the forest shift, a subtle movement in the shadows, like something was circling me, hurting me, controlling me without touch. Panic took over. I turned and ran, branches lashing at my face, roots clawing at my boots, the mist thickening until I could barely see my own hands. Behind me, the whispers grew louder, distorted, chanting or calling, impossible to distinguish. I didn't dare look back. I ran until my lungs burned, until the forest began to thin, until the familiar trails of the campground appeared, the gravel crunching beneath my feet, a grounding, tangible reality. I collapsed at the RV, shaking uncontrollably. The door was locked, the interior safe, at least physically, but the force had entered my mind. I couldn't leave, not really. My thoughts were a tangle of fear, guilt, and despair. Marcus was out there, part of the forest now, or worse, claimed by it entirely. The rules of the Black Hills were inscrutable, invisible, yet absolute. Enter on your terms, leave on theirs, or don't leave at all. I spent the night staring through the windows, flashlight trained on the mist, listening to the forest's rhythms, every sound amplified, every shadow exaggerated. and in the dead hours I thought I saw him, just for a second, a figure tall and thin at the edge of the trees, motionless, watching. My chest tightened. I called his name. No response. Only the forest breathed back. By the morning, the figure was gone, the mist lifted, and the forest returned to its deceptive calm. I knew then that Marcus's disappearance wasn't a simple accident, a misstep, or even a random event. The forest had chosen him, shaped him, claimed him. And for me, it left a warning. Curiosity and recklessness, when faced with forces beyond comprehension, carry a cost. I packed the RV again, finally leaving the campground, retracing my steps along the winding roads with an acute awareness that the Black Hills were never truly behind me. Every curve, every shadow, every whisper of wind reminded me of the hollow, the stump, the footprints, the presence that had warped reality and taken my friend. Driving away, I kept checking the mirrors, scanning the tree line. Sometimes I thought I saw him, just a glimpse of a figure standing between the trees, too still, too deliberate. And each time I realized it wasn't him. Or maybe it was, but not as I knew him. He had become part of the forest, inseparable, a warning, a testament to the dangers of ignoring instincts, of entering spaces without respect, of assuming we understand forces far older and stranger than ourselves. The lessons I carried were heavy, etched into memory. Trust your instincts, respect the unknown, and never underestimate the subtle intelligence of places that seem passive but are anything but. Marcus's disappearance was a tragedy, yes, but it was also a revelation. The forest isn't neutral. It isn't a backdrop. It's an active participant, shaping events, dictating outcomes, observing, judging, claiming. And if you linger too long, if you push too far, if you fail to heed the quiet warnings, you may vanish too. Slowly, deliberately, silently. Even now, when I return to the Black Hills, driving roads lined with familiar trees, I carry the weight of those days, the echo of footsteps in mist, the whisper of branches that bend in impossible ways, the haunting certainty that some part of Marcus remains there, a presence, a warning, intertwined with the forest itself. I know I will never fully escape it, and that the memory of him, the terror, and the lessons learned will follow me, shaping every choice, every mile, every quiet moment when the wind presses against the RV, reminding me that the forest never forgets, never forgives, and never relinquishes what it claims. I didn't return to the same campground for months. Every time I drove past the winding roads that led deeper into the Black Hills, I felt the pull, the same subtle tug I'd felt during those first terrifying days after Marcus disappeared. But I couldn't go back. Not fully. The forest had marked him, and by extension, it had marked me. It wasn't just fear I carried. It was an understanding of limits, a deep knowledge that some spaces aren't meant to be tamed, that curiosity has edges sharper than you can imagine. Still, I couldn't entirely let go. The need to reconcile, to find closure, gnawed at me. I'd take long drives along the outskirts, eyes scanning tree lines for the impossible, ears attuned to the faintest irregularities in wind or wildlife, a whisper out of place. And sometimes, in the quiet, when the sunlight fractured over pine needles just right, I could almost see him, or something that resembled him, standing still, watching, as if testing whether I had learned the lesson the forest demanded. On one of these drives, I stopped at a small clearing I'd once overlooked, not far from where the RV had been parked. The forest here seemed deceptively calm, almost welcoming. I stepped out of the vehicle, heart hammering, lungs drawing the crisp, cold air, and for the first time in months, I let myself truly listen. The rustle of leaves was no longer taunting, it was neutral, simply the forest breathing. And for a moment I could imagine Marcus walking somewhere beyond the visible edge of the trees, alive in some sense, somewhere unbound by the limitations of ordinary life. But the memory of the stump, the hollow, the footprints that defied logic, and the whispers that had echoed in the mist returned instantly. They reminded me that the forest was not a place to conquer, but to respect. I thought about how easy it had been to follow instinct into danger, to dismiss intuition in favor of curiosity. I realized the true terror of those days wasn't just Marcus's disappearance, it was my own vulnerability, the fragile line between awareness and recklessness, and the forest's capacity to illuminate that truth with merciless clarity. I drove away that afternoon, slowly, deliberately, taking extra care to avoid the narrower trails, scanning the tree line, keeping my distance while still allowing myself to remember. The sun was low, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly, and I felt, perhaps for the first time since the disappearance, a kind of peace settling into the tension in my chest. Not relief, never relief, but recognition. Recognition that some experiences are meant to alter you, to leave an indelible mark, and that survival isn't just about escaping danger, it's about carrying its lessons forward. Marcus's absence haunted me, yes. It still does. I sometimes wake in the night listening to the ordinary creaks of the RV, and for a heartbeat I imagine him there, leaning casually against the wall, grinning like nothing happened. Then the reality presses back, heavy and inescapable, and I remember the power of the forest and the fragility of human expectation. I began to share the story, first with a few close friends who loved camping, then with a wider circle, always careful to convey the truth without embellishment. The forest isn't a villain. It's a force. Neutral, alive, deliberate. And the lesson I learned that I hope others can learn without paying the price Marcus did is simple. Trust your instincts, respect your surroundings, and that sometimes curiosity carries consequences beyond comprehension. Over time, I've returned to RV camping, but differently now. I plan meticulously, respect boundaries, pay attention to the subtleties, the wind, the smell of the air, the way shadows stretch, the rhythm of sounds. The Black Hills taught me that vigilance isn't paranoia, it's survival. Awareness isn't fear, it's wisdom. And while Marcus is gone, his absence is a teacher, a constant reminder that the forest doesn't forget, that the unknown demands respect, and that the line between adventure and peril is finer than any map can show. There are nights when I close my eyes and see him in the mist, near the stream, standing just at the edge of perception, a reminder of what was lost and what was learned. And though the pain of that memory is sharp, it is also grounding. It tells me to move forward carefully, to embrace wonder without overstepping, to recognize that some forces, natural, unseen, or otherwise, operate on a scale beyond comprehension. I carry this with me every time I park the RV under a canopy of trees, every time I listen to the whisper of leaves in a twilight breeze, every time I navigate a trail where the earth is soft and the shadows long. The Black Hills are beautiful, mysterious, intoxicating, but they are also alive, and their memory is permanent. The forest has a rhythm, a patience, a consciousness, and it will endure long after we have left its paths. And as for Marcus, he remains a part of it. Whether he exists now in some tangible form, or whether he has been absorbed into the strange eternal pulse of the forest, I cannot say. But I know he is a teacher in his absence, a testament to the dangers of overconfidence, the consequences of ignoring instinct, and the respect owed to places that hold more than meets the eye. Driving home from the Black Hills, I felt a mixture of sorrow and reverence. Loss had etched itself into my bones, but so had understanding. I realized that what had happened wasn't just a disappearance. It was a transformation, not just of Marcus, but of me. The fear I had endured had stripped away illusions, revealing the raw edges of reality. And through that fear, I learned vigilance, respect, and humility, the kind of lessons no ordinary adventure could ever provide. I'll never forget the sounds, the shadows, the mist, the whispers, or the tiny footprints that led nowhere. They are embedded in memory, forever part of the rhythm of my life, echoing the warning that some curiosity is too costly, that the line between exploration and peril is unyielding, and that every forest, every wilderness, every unknown corner of the world carries a consciousness that can either guide or consume, depending on how we approach it. Marcus's disappearance remains unexplained. The forest keeps its secrets. And for anyone who ventures into the Black Hills or anywhere wild and untamed, remember this. Respect the silence, Heed the subtle signs, trust your instincts, and understand that survival is not just about physical endurance, it's about reading the world, understanding the forces that shape it, and carrying the lessons learned, even when they are painful, even when they come at the cost of those we love most. Because sometimes the most terrifying things aren't monsters, aren't shadows, aren't the unknown itself. They are the consequences of ignoring the quiet, insistent wisdom that has been whispering all along. And in that whisper, I still hear Marcus, still feel the pulse of the Black Hills, and still understand the fragile, humbling, life-altering truth. The wilderness is alive, and it remembers everything. I didn't plan to stop at Mount Hood that night. I had meant to push farther south, maybe hit a quieter campground closer to the Cascades foothills, someplace where the fog didn't cling to the pavement like old memories refusing to lift. But the road signs kept shifting in the beam of my Volkswagen's headlights, just slightly, just enough that distances felt wrong. I'd pass a mile marker, swear it said 42, then glance back in the rearview mirror and see a blurred 41 or maybe 40 behind me. By the time I reached a turnout overlooking the dark silhouette of the mountain, I felt an ache behind my eyes like I'd been squinting at something too bright or too familiar. I parked, cut the engine, and listened to the ticking metal cooling down. The fog swirled, folding over itself, and I remember thinking it moved like breath. Slow. Intentional. I had camped in worse conditions before, but the stillness here had weight, like sound itself was sinking under the moisture. No wind, no insects, no distant hum of tires on a highway. Even the forest seemed to wait, listening for something I couldn't hear. The ranger station down the road had been boarded up, though the notice posted on the wall looked new. A laminated sheet, edges crisp, at warning hikers not to attempt the Timberline Trail alone after dusk. Nothing new there. It was November, weather unpredictable, but a line near the bottom caught me off guard. It read, "If you see lights on the ridge after midnight, report to the nearest ranger. Do not approach." I'd heard variations of that warning before, in other parks, other forests. In some stories, it was voices. In others, reflections in windows repeating gestures out of sync. It was always some small, strange detail that seemed to echo from one place to another, like a half-remembered dream. But I didn't think about that then. I just folded the laminated notice into my pocket and walked back to the van. Inside, the air felt warmer, the faint smell of cedar oil rising from the wooden paneling I had installed last summer. I cracked the window just slightly, enough to hear the outside air shift, but it didn't move. Not even a leaf scraped against the dirt. That was the first thing that unsettled me, though I told myself it was only the altitude, that at this elevation, maybe sound behaved differently. I made dinner quietly, listening for anything. A branch snapping, an owl, something. But the silence clung to everything, pressing around the van like padded walls. Eventually, I turned on a small battery-powered radio, letting the faint static fill the gaps in my breathing. I didn't care what I tuned into. I just needed something to break the stillness. But every station drifted in and out, repeating fragments of songs that didn't match the melodies I knew. Like the radio kept jumping to parts that shouldn't exist. A few seconds of guitar, a line of lyrics, then silence, as if someone had erased the rest of the track from existence. I turned it off. Maybe the quiet was getting to me. Maybe I needed sleep. I lay down in the back of the van and stared at the ceiling, tracing the grain lines I'd memorized from countless nights on the road. I used to find comfort in those lines. They reminded me of how simple things could be, how grounded. But that night, the pattern seemed off, tilted slightly, as if the van itself wasn't level anymore, as if those lines were pointing toward something. At some point, I drifted into a half-sleep, the kind where the body rests but the mind refuses to. That's when I heard it, a soft exhale outside the window, not a gust, not an animal. It sounded human, close enough that the glass should have fogged, but when I looked, nothing was there. Only the fog, dense, curling, slowly pulling back like someone unseen was stepping away. I sat up, pulse tapping against my throat. I told myself the air pressure had changed, that my brain, desperate for noise, had invented the sound. But then it came again, from the other side of the van. A steady breath, long and deliberate, the kind you hear when someone is trying to calm themselves down. I grabbed the flashlight and slipped out of the van, boots crunching faintly against damp soil. The fog swallowed the beam immediately, leaving only a pale halo around my feet. The forest loomed in vague, shifting silhouettes, shapes bending the longer I stared. The smell of wet earth mixed with something faintly metallic, a tang that reminded me of old batteries or blood dried under sun. "Is someone there?" I said, voice quieter than I meant it to be. No response. I told myself no one comes up here at night. I told myself no one would stand in fog thick enough to erase their outline. But then I heard a rustle, a slow movement, like fabric brushing bark. Then a whisper. Not words, just breath shaped into something almost meaningful. My hand tightened around the flashlight, but I didn't move closer. Not yet. Not with the fog shifting like it was remembering paths it had taken before. I backed up step by step until my shoulders bumped the van. I climbed in but kept the door open just a crack, listening. The fog seemed to pulse, drawing close, pulling back, like it had its own rhythm. And beneath it all, a faint vibration hummed through the ground, like distant footsteps, slow and steady. I pulled the cracked ranger notice from my pocket, scanning it again. No mention of breathing fog or footsteps under soil. Just the warning about lights on the ridge, but someone had handwritten a small symbol in the corner. A looping spiral crossed with a single vertical line. I'd seen that before. In a blog post about disappearances in the Rockies, one that vanished from the internet a week after it was published. People had shared screenshots, grainy and incomplete, except for that symbol in the corner of a map. It looked exactly the same now. I wasn't sure if I felt fear or recognition. Maybe both. The fog thickened, crawling under the van, lifting in lazy swells around the tires. The smell of metal grew sharper, mixing with the cedar inside. My throat tightened. The air felt heavy, as if it wanted to settle inside my lungs. Then something moved to my left. Slow, dragging. I swung the flashlight, but the beam bent strangely, curving through the fog like it passed over something invisible. The air shimmered, and I swear for a second I saw the outline of a shoulder, then a head, then nothing. As if the fog was remembering a person who used to stand there and briefly decided to show me the shape. I slammed the van door shut. Inside, the radio clicked on by itself, not to a station, just to static, but the static pulsed in a pattern, slow at first, then quicker, then slow, almost like breathing. I reached for the knob, but halfway there I froze. The static wasn't random. It was forming something, a sound like someone speaking through water, their voice stretched thin by distance. It whispered the same pattern of breath I'd heard outside. I turned the radio off. The static kept going. My hands shook. The inside of the van felt smaller, the cedar-lined walls pressing inward. I tried focusing on my breathing, counting each inhale, each exhale, but the fog outside seemed to match my rhythm, swelling and shrinking with every breath I took, like it was learning, like it was remembering me. I told myself I could leave. Just turn the key, drive away, don't look back. But I didn't move. Something held me there, not fear of the fog, but fear of what leaving would confirm. That the world outside the van wasn't behaving the way it should. That something familiar, something I'd felt at other campsites, other nights, had finally drawn close enough for me to notice. A faint tapping hit the back window. One tap. Pause. Two taps. Like someone testing a memory. The fog outside curled, waiting, and for a moment, I wasn't sure if I was still awake. I stayed frozen for a long time after that tapping, my breath held tight in my chest, as if any movement might provoke whatever waited outside. The fog wrapped around the van in slow curls, sliding across the windows like fingertips tracing the outline of the glass. Every instinct told me to turn the ignition and go, but something deeper, some quieter, older hesitation held me in place. Like if I moved too quickly, I would confirm that what I heard was real. And once something becomes real in the dark, it's hard to make it unreal again. I leaned closer to the back window, listening. The fog swelled, folding into itself, and in the silence between heartbeats, I swore I heard words. Not in English, not in any language I recognized. More like the fog was trying to mimic speech, trying to remember sounds it once heard from someone else. I whispered, "Stop." And it did. Not the fog, not entirely. But the tapping stopped with such abrupt obedience that my stomach turned cold. I hadn't expected anything to listen. For a moment, everything went still. Then, gently, as if apologizing, the fog brushed against the van again. A part of me wanted to laugh. Another part wanted to cry. Instead, I reached for the ignition. The key slid in easily, but when I tried to turn it, the engine only clicked. Soft, repetitive, mechanical. A lifeless sound. My battery was new, my wiring clean. There was no reason it shouldn't start. No reason except the fog pressing closer, weight settling on the roof like a hand. I shut my eyes. The silence squeezed down on me again, tightening until I felt it in my teeth. I forced myself to breathe slowly, evenly, reminding myself that panic never helps. The fog wasn't a creature. It wasn't alive. It was just moisture, pressure, temperature. My brain was filling in the rest. That's what I told myself. But then the radio clicked on again. Not static this time. A voice. Faint, muffled, like it was being played on a recorder that had been left out in the rain for years. It repeated a single phrase, though the quality made it hard to decipher. On the third repeat, the shape of the words finally formed enough for me to understand. It's the same path, even when you turn. I felt an icy tremor roll from my spine down into my legs. I had heard that phrase before, not in this van, not even this year. It was something an old man had muttered to me at a campground in Utah after seeing a map I was using to plan a route. He'd pointed at a loop trail and said those same words, "It's the same path, even when you turn," and then he'd laughed like it was a joke meant for someone else. When I asked him what he meant, he only said he'd been on a trail once that didn't match what was printed on paper. That some places remember people, some places remember wrong. I hadn't thought about that conversation in months. Now the radio whispered it again, the voice warped and creaking, like it was being replayed from memory rather than a broadcast. I turned the dial until it clicked off. The voice didn't stop. I covered the radio with my jacket. The voice seeped through the fabric. A wave of nausea hit me, sharp and unexpected. I pressed my palm against the floor to steady myself. The van felt like it was tilting, listing slightly to the left, or maybe the fog was shifting the ground beneath me. For a moment, I thought I could feel the soil breathing, rising, falling, slow and deliberate. The smell of metal thickened. Static crawled gently at the edges of my hearing, blending into the breathy murmur outside. My throat tightened. I couldn't tell if I was inhaling fog, fear, or both. I needed air. Real air. Not this recycled panic. I opened the side door. The fog didn't rush in. It just drifted, soft as snowfall. I stepped out slowly, every muscle tight. My flashlight beam wavered, bending in the fog's density. The trees around me blurred into tall, looming forms, their shapes shifting as if they were leaning closer, listening. Something in the fog pulsed, like a memory brushing against my shoulder. "Okay," I whispered. "I'm leaving." I moved toward the front of the van, reaching for the hood release, thinking maybe I could fix the battery cables. But halfway there, I noticed footprints in the dirt. Not mine. Not recent, either. They looked softened at the edges, like they'd been stepped in hours ago, then preserved, untouched by wind or rain. But the fog had weight and moisture. Those prints should have blurred. I crouched, shining the flashlight carefully. The footprints formed a circle around the van. A perfect circle. Each step turned inward, as if someone had walked slowly around my campsite for a long time, studying the van from every angle. My chest tightened. I followed the prints backward with the light, tracing them into the fog. And that's when I saw it, a darker shape, a little denser than the fog itself. As if a person was standing just beyond where the light could clarify edges. The beam curved around the shape, bending like water flowing around a rock. I blinked hard. The shape dissolved, fading back into the white. The fog seemed to exhale. I stumbled backward and gripped the van's door frame. My breath came unevenly now, every exhale too short, every inhale too shallow. I forced myself to focus, grounding with details, the cold metal under my fingers, the damp scent of pine needles, the faint vibration under the soil. Except that vibration was getting stronger, steadier, more rhythmic. Footsteps, slow, heavy, deep beneath the earth. They were moving toward me. I climbed back into the van and slammed the door. The radio crackled sharply, the static now rising in pitch. It sounded almost like a hum, a melody warped beyond recognition, a pattern. Then, under the static, I heard another sound, like someone whispering directly behind me. I turned, but the back of the van was empty. The whisper came again, closer this time, curling under my ear like breath. Don't forget. I jerked forward, slamming my knee against the counter. My pulse hammered so loudly I could barely hear anything else. I looked around frantically, scanning every corner. The air inside felt thinner, like the van wasn't big enough to hold both me and whatever memory the fog was trying to place inside my head. The whisper came again, gentler this time. Don't forget. The ridge. The ridge. I swallowed hard. I had been there once, years ago, during a late summer hike. I remembered the view, the jagged line of rock cutting through the clouds. I remembered thinking it felt older than the rest of the mountain, and I remembered, though I had never told anyone this, seeing a light flicker just beyond the tree line. A warm, golden glow, pulsing faintly like a lantern, being carried by someone walking slowly, steadily. I had convinced myself it was another hiker. But now the fog pressed closer, as if aware I was remembering. The footprints outside the van had all faced inward, and the fog seemed to know me. I didn't think the fog wanted to hurt me. Not exactly. It felt more like it wanted to place something back inside me that I had forgotten. A memory, a warning, a path I once walked. Something deep beneath the soil thudded again, closer now. I grabbed the steering wheel, knuckles white, and whispered, "Please start." I turned the key. The engine didn't roar to life. It didn't even stutter. It breathed in, a low, long inhalation, like the van itself was remembering how to be alive. Then something outside answered with a breath of its own. The fog leaned against the windows. The soil vibrated. The radio whispered the phrase again. It's the same path, even when you turn. And for the first time that night, I felt a pull. Not fear, not curiosity, but recognition, like the mountain had been waiting for me to come back. The first time I heard my own voice in the fog, I thought it was an echo. I had cracked the driver's side window just an inch, trying to balance the stale air inside with the thick metallic breath outside. My hands wouldn't let go of the steering wheel. My knuckles ached from the tension. I whispered to myself, testing the world, testing reality. "This isn't real," I said. "You're overtired. You're just hearing patterns." From somewhere out in the fog, a heartbeat later, my voice answered back. "This isn't real." Same tone, same pitch. Just slightly wrong, like someone had taken the audio and stretched it, brushed it with static. It came from the wrong direction too, not from ahead where my voice had traveled, but from somewhere above and to the right, as if the mountain itself were replaying me from a different angle. I felt something inside me give. Not break exactly, more like a knot that had been holding all my doubt in one place finally slipping loose. My grip on what was reasonable and rational started to slide. I tried again. "Who's there?" I asked quietly. "Who's there?" The echo came back, but slower this time, like the fog had to search its memory for the words. The sound seemed to travel sideways through the mist, not back to me in a straight line, like an echo in a canyon that decides to answer from somewhere it was never sent. The phrase hit me from behind then, too close. "Who's there?" My breath stuttered. The van felt too small again, the air thinning. I forced myself to move, to do something that made sense. I reached for my pack and pulled out the folded map of the area, a paper comfort, something that still belonged to the world of trailheads and mileage and contour lines. I spread it out on my lap, fingers trembling. The timberline trail circled the mountain in a clear loop, broken into sections, ridges, drainages. I traced the ridge I remembered from years ago, the place where I'd seen that lone light beyond the tree line. It was marked, barely, a faint line branching off the main trail, ending at an unlabeled overlook. Except I didn't remember it looking like that. In my memory, the ridge path bent more sharply, curving back on itself before reaching the overlook. Now, on paper, it just drifted straight out like a spear. I blinked, leaning closer. Someone had drawn something there, right at the end of the spur. Not a symbol from the map legend. A tiny spiral with a line through it. The same mark that was in the corner of the ranger notice. The same mark I'd seen in that vanished blog post about the Rockies. The one that disappeared like someone scrubbed it off the internet and rewrote the empty space. Static buzzed in my ears, though the radio was silent now. For a moment, all the sounds merged. The remembered blog, the Utah camper's warning, the ridge with the light, the scribbled spiral. It all stacked in my head like layers of tracing paper. Different places, same shape. It's the same path, even when you turn. The phrase felt heavier now, as if it belonged not to one old man or one radio voice, but to whatever sat underneath all these places, as constant and invisible as bedrock. Outside, the fog thickened again, pressing against the windshield. The world beyond the glass faded, leaving only a faint silhouette of the nearest tree. A vertical shadow with branches that looked more like reaching fingers every time I glanced at it. My chest tightened. I couldn't sit there anymore. Something in me snapped from quiet anxiety into movement, the hinge between doubt and fear, between staying and breaking. I grabbed my headlamp, shoved the ranger notice and the map into my jacket pocket, and opened the door before I could convince myself not to. The fog met me immediately. Cool, damp, and strangely still. Not swirling like wind-driven mist, but hanging with intention. My breath puffed out in a pale cloud that didn't move forward so much as it seemed to be swallowed, absorbed into the thicker air. "I'm leaving," I said again, my voice steadying now that I was outside. "I'm walking down to the main road. Someone can tow me out in the morning." The fog didn't echo that phrase, it only breathed with me. I locked the van, out of habit, not luck, and started toward where I knew the road had to be. I'd parked at a turnout, backed in, facing the trees, with the road behind me. It should have been simple. Walk out, turn right, follow the yellow lines. My boots crunched softly on damp dirt and gravel. The sound felt too loud, too alone. After a few steps, I realized I couldn't see the van's shape behind me anymore. The fog had folded it away like a page turned in a book. I kept walking, 30 paces. The road should have appeared under my feet, the texture changing from gravel to asphalt, but the ground stayed the same. Needles, dirt, small stones. No paint, no rumble of distant traffic. My chest tightened. I pulled the map out again, more to anchor myself than to use it. The headlamp cast a pale circle across the paper. The lines seemed to waver just slightly, as if the ink were still deciding where it wanted to settle. The mountain contour bulged, flexed, then snapped back. I squeezed my eyes shut and reopened them. The ridge spur was darker now, bolder, as if someone had traced over it since the last time I looked. Behind me in the fog, I heard my own footsteps, not echoing, matching, perfectly in sync. Each time my boot hit the ground, another set did too, just a fraction softer, just far enough away that I couldn't place the direction. Fear crawled up my spine. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. Turning back suddenly felt like stepping into a loop designed not to end. I tested it anyway. I took a sudden sharp left, aiming to cut across where I knew the road must be. The fog thickened, swallowing my headlamp beam. The ground dipped slightly, then rose. The footsteps behind me followed, adjusting smoothly. I walked faster. The footsteps did too. I broke into a jog, ignoring the way my lungs burned from the cold, damp air. Every breath tasted metallic now. Every inhale felt heavier, like the fog was layering itself inside me, lining my throat and chest. The footsteps never fell behind. The sound stayed exactly the same distance away, no matter how fast I moved. It reminded me suddenly of something I'd read years ago, some obscure forum thread about a hiker in the desert who claimed the echoes in the canyons didn't bounce straight back, but slid sideways, carrying pieces of other people's voices. The comment under it had stayed with me. The desert echoes, but not always in the direction you expect. I dismissed it as poetic nonsense at the time. Now on this mountain, suffocating in fog that seemed to remember more than I did, I realized they might have been describing this exactly. Not a desert of sand and rock, but a desert of reference points, a blank space where sound and path and time got bent into loops. I didn't know how long I walked. Minutes, an hour, the fog made the distance meaningless. There was only the rhythm, my breath, my steps, the other set of footsteps mirroring mine perfectly, like a shadow that refused to detach. At some point, the ground tilted, sloping gently upward. My calves burned. My chest ached. The invisible weight of the mountain settled more firmly on my shoulders. And then I saw it, a faint warm glow bleeding through the fog ahead, golden and pulsing softly, not harsh like car headlights. It looked exactly like the ridge light I remembered from years ago, only I wasn't supposed to be anywhere near the ridge. Panic snapped clean through me, sharp and electric. I dug the map out, hands shaking so badly the paper rattled. The headlamp beam shook across the contour lines. The ridge spur was darker still, the end of it circled in a faint ring of yellow, as if someone had highlighted it from the inside. Somewhere, deep beneath the static in my ears, under the sound of my heart pounding, I heard a whisper. Don't forget the ridge. I should have turned around. I should have walked the other way until my legs gave out. But part of me already knew I wouldn't find the van that way. I wouldn't find the road. I just keep walking the same path, even when I turned, the fog rearranging itself around me, looping the ground under my feet. The only thing that had changed was the light, so I went toward it. The glow grew brighter as I approached, though it never resolved into a clear source. It stayed blurred, as if I were looking at it through smeared glass. The fog around it swirled more actively, currents moving in slow, spiraling patterns. I smelled cedar and metal and something else now, something faintly sweet, like old smoke trapped in fabric for years. When I got close enough, I saw the rock. It rose out of the ground like a tooth, smooth on top, edges cracked from age and frost. The glow seemed to seep out from beneath it, not shine from above. The fog curled into it like breath being drawn into lungs. On the flat surface of the stone, carved into the center, was the same spiral crossed with a line. Fresh, edges sharp, like it had been waiting for me. My knees nearly buckled. Memories crashed together without order. Utah, the old man, the vanished blog, the ranger notice, other nights in other forests where the air felt too still, where shadows lingered too long under my camper, where the map and the land never quite agreed. I realized this symbol wasn't about a single place. It was about whatever connects all of them. The footsteps behind me stopped. For the first time since I started walking, there was no shadow rhythm mirroring my movements. The silence was so sudden it roared. My ears rang with it. I placed my hand on the stone before I could think better of it. It was warm, not just from trapped heat or the strange glow below, warm like something living, something aware. A slow pulse thudded within it, faint but unmistakable. Images flickered at the edge of my vision, not clear scenes, just impressions. Headlights caught in fog, a tent collapsing under unseen weight, water moving backward up a shore, a canyon echoing a name it was never given. The world misremembering itself in a dozen different places. I yanked my hand back, gasping. The fog exhaled, rushing away from me in a sudden rolling wave. The glow under the stone dimmed, then went out entirely, leaving only my headlamp and the thin, cold light of a sky I hadn't seen in hours. Stars. Actual stars. The mountain's silhouette reemerged, sharp and grounded. The outlines of trees became just trees again. The footsteps didn't come back. Behind me, down the slope, I saw the faint outline of the road cutting through the darkness. Yellow lines. Guardrail. One lonely turnout. My van sat there exactly where I'd left it, patient and small, under the weight of everything I couldn't explain. I walked back on trembling legs, not trusting how fast the fog had retreated. Every step felt borrowed. Every breath felt like something I'd taken from the mountain without permission. The van started on the first turn of the key. The radio stayed off, though for a second, in the hum of the engine, I almost thought I heard it whisper one last time. It's the same path, even when you turn. I drove down from Mount Hood with my hands clenched and my eyes constantly checking the rearview mirror, half expecting the fog to surge back over the hood, to fill the cabin, to replay my voice from some wrong direction. But the road stayed clear. The sky stayed open. By the time I reached lower elevation, the night looked almost ordinary. Almost. Days later, when I spread the map out again on a diner table far from the mountain, the ridge spur was gone. The contour lines smoothed over, unbroken. No overlook, no side trail, no spiral carved into rock. The ranger notice? I still had it. The laminated sheet creased from my pocket. The warning about lights after midnight was there, printed in clean black type. But the spiral in the corner had faded to almost nothing, just the faintest indentation in the plastic, like a fingerprint left in wet paint years ago. Sometimes, when I'm parked alone now, whether in the mountains or the desert or by some nameless river, the air will go quiet. Too quiet. Sounds will bend, an echo will come back from the wrong place. And I'll remember the fog at Mount Hood and the feeling that the world itself was trying to return something to me it thought I had lost. I used to trust what I saw, what I smelled, what I heard. Now I trust patterns more than individual moments. I trust the way certain phrases repeat themselves from different mouths. I trust the way certain symbols appear where they shouldn't. I trust the way some maps shift ever so slightly when you're not looking. The desert echoes, but not always in the direction you expect. Neither does the mountain. Neither do the stories we tell ourselves about what is real and what is just fog. And if you ever find yourself alone at night, somewhere the air feels like it's listening, somewhere the path doesn't quite match the paper in your hand, pay attention to what repeats, to the smells you can't place, to the sounds coming from the wrong angle. Because sometimes it's not your memory that's failing. Sometimes it's the world around you that remembers too much. And it's trying in its own break you remember with it. I never thought I'd find myself out here, alone on the back roads of Appalachia, the engine of my old Volkswagen humming like a nervous heartbeat beneath me. The sun was bleeding away behind the ridges, and the shadows stretched long and crooked, folding the trees into strange, angular shapes. I told myself I just needed a weekend to escape, to breathe, to disconnect. But something in the air pressed against my chest as I drove deeper into the forest. Maybe it was the smell of damp earth, or the way the wind whispered through the pine needles like voices you almost recognized. Whatever it was, I didn't stop, even though part of me wanted to turn back. My name is Alex, 32, a graphic designer from Charlotte who spends more time dreaming of the open road than actually walking it. I've camped before, sure, RV parks with fluorescent lights and friendly neighbors, but this was different. I wanted the kind of solitude that makes you question whether you're really alone, the kind that reveals something inside yourself you didn't know was there. I parked the Volkswagen on a narrow dirt spur just off a gravel road that seemed to vanish into the forest, pulling the handbrake tight and listening to the engine click as it cooled. The only sounds were the occasional bird call and the scrape of my tires against the dirt as I stepped out. The campground itself was a ghost. Rusted signs leaned against trees, and a chain-link fence sagged in the gaps where it had rotted away. According to the faded brochure I'd found online, it was still technically open, but there were no rangers in sight, no other campers. Just me. And I had a fleeting sense that the forest was waiting, holding its breath. I set up the small canvas tarp I'd brought, strung between two pines, and unpacked my modest supplies. The air was already growing cooler, heavier, scented with wet moss and pine resin. I started a small fire, watching the flames lick the air while I told myself this was normal, the kind of nervous energy anyone feels when they're isolated, but deep down I felt eyes on me. The shadows at the edges of the fire seemed to shift, not just with the flicker of the flames, but almost with intent, as if the trees themselves were leaning closer to watch. Night in the Appalachian backwoods is a different kind of dark. It's not just the absence of light, it's a presence. The air grows thick, the wind carries voices you can't place, and every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves feels magnified, personal. Around 11 p.m., I was huddled near the fire, sipping coffee from my thermos, when I heard it, a low, guttural noise that seemed too deliberate to be an animal. My heart hammered, and I told myself it was probably a bear, or a raccoon, or a trick of the wind. But there was a rhythm to it, a pattern that made my skin crawl. It came again, closer this time, circling the clearing, and I froze, listening. I remember gripping the side of the Volkswagen, feeling the cold metal under my fingers, and wondering if I should start the engine and leave. But the curiosity, stubborn, foolish, relentless, kept me rooted. That's when I saw it, just on the edge of the firelight, a dark shape, hunched, moving with an unnatural gait. I swear it wasn't a person, not entirely. Its limbs seemed wrong, elongated, almost like the sketches you see in cryptid lore. My rational mind screamed at me to dismiss it, but instinct screamed louder. I slumped back against the van, breath shallow, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. It's hard to measure time when fear distorts everything. The shape disappeared as suddenly as it appeared, melting into the forest like smoke. I thought about packing up and leaving, but pride and the stubborn thrill of the unknown kept me. Sleep was impossible. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made me jump. At some point, I began to whisper to myself, reciting memories, family birthdays, mundane things, just to keep my mind tethered to the familiar. By dawn, the forest seemed less sinister, but no less tense. Sunlight filtered through the canopy in slivers, and I could finally see the narrow road stretching ahead, lined with ancient oaks and birches. I told myself I'd seen nothing, that my mind had played tricks in the dark. And yet, in the back of my mind, I knew I hadn't. Something had been there. Something aware. The Volkswagen's engine coughed to life, and I drove slowly, scanning the woods, every shadow now loaded with possibility. Later that day, I met a local, Harold, a man in his late 50s, with calloused hands and a gaze that seemed to see the layers beneath the world. He was checking an old trailhead near the edge of the forest, his truck laden with gear. We exchanged polite nods, then casual conversation, and before long I found myself describing carefully what I had seen. Harold didn't laugh. He didn't dismiss me. He simply nodded and said, "You're not the first one." "You mean people see things like that here?" I asked, feeling a shiver run down my spine. He leaned against his truck, eyes narrowing as he gazed into the thickening woods. Some call it Bigfoot. Others, just the old ones. They've been around this forest longer than any of us. Watch, listen, respect. That's the best you can do. His words stuck with me as I continued down the winding back roads, the Volkswagen humming along, tires crunching gravel. By the time I stopped at another clearing to rest, I felt a strange calm. Fear, I realized, wasn't always about running. Sometimes it was about paying attention, listening to what the world was quietly telling you. That day, the forest became less a place of random terror and more a teacher. That evening, I parked near a small stream, letting the Volkswagen rest beside the gentle murmur of running water. The shadows were long, but less oppressive. I started a small fire and unpacked a simple meal. As darkness settled in, I heard it again, a distant howl, low and rolling, echoing across the valley. This time I didn't panic. I listened. I smelled the pine, felt the wet earth beneath my boots, and realized that fear, carefully observed, can teach you more than comfort ever will. I stayed awake most of the night, watching the dark, listening to the whispers of the trees, letting the forest settle me. By the next morning, I understood something essential. The back roads, the abandoned campsites, the strange noises, they were all part of a dialogue, an unspoken pact between humans and the unknown. You come here, you tread carefully, you respect the unseen, You survive, and you grow. Driving out, I felt lighter. The Volkswagen seemed more than a vehicle. It was a bridge to a place where I confronted the parts of myself that fear has always shadowed. And though I never saw the dark figure again, I knew it was there, watching, teaching, waiting for the next curious soul brave or foolish enough to wander. The road ahead twisted and narrowed as I drove deeper into the forest. Each bend felt like a challenge, as if the land itself were testing my courage and measuring my resolve. The Volkswagen's tires crunched over loose gravel, and the engine's hum became a steady companion, a heartbeat against the oppressive quiet. I told myself I was ready for whatever this forest had to offer, but deep down, a part of me knew I wasn't. Around mid-morning, I pulled off onto a small side path that barely looked passable. The map I'd brought marked it as Old Hollow Trail, though the name alone carried an unspoken warning. The canopy overhead was dense, casting jagged shadows across the road. Sunlight flickered like a nervous signal, and the air smelled sharper here. Wet leaves, moss, and something tangentially metallic, faint but unmistakable. I parked the Volkswagen in a small clearing, the tires sinking slightly into the soft earth. I got out, stretching, trying to shake off a creeping sensation that someone, or something, was studying me from the trees. I took my pack and followed the trail, my boots crunching against rotting leaves. The forest was alive with sound, but it was deceptive. Birds called in familiar patterns, yet their cries seemed elongated, distorted, almost questioning. Every step made me hyper-aware of the slightest movement. A branch bending where no wind could reach it, a shadow that flickered but had no discernible source. My heartbeat accelerated in time with each small sound, each rustle. About 30 minutes in, I stumbled across a small cabin, half collapsed and swallowed by vines. The wood was blackened in patches, rotted and brittle. A small, rusted sign hung loosely from one hinge, "Welcome to Whisper Hollow." The irony of the name wasn't lost on me, and I felt a strange tug, like an invisible hand urging me to explore, to see what secrets lay inside. The door creaked loudly as I nudged it with my shoulder, and the smell hit me first. Damp wood, mold, and something faintly metallic like old blood. I swallowed hard, telling myself it was nothing, and stepped inside. The interior was sparse, almost barren. Broken furniture leaned against the walls, and the remnants of a small kitchen lay scattered. But what caught my attention wasn't the decay. It was the markings on the walls. Strange symbols, scratched deep into the wood, formed a pattern almost like a language I couldn't recognize. They were jagged, uneven, and the way the light from my flashlight caught them made them seem almost alive, pulsing with a rhythm that set my nerves on edge. I knelt to examine them, trying to decipher meaning, to anchor myself in reason. That's when I heard it, a low, almost guttural exhale from somewhere behind me. I froze, every muscle tensing. My irrational mind insisted it was an animal, maybe a raccoon, maybe something bigger, but my instincts screamed otherwise. I turned slowly, my flashlight trembling slightly in my hand, and saw a shape retreating into the shadows near the far wall. Not quite human, not quite animal. Its limbs were long, disproportionate, and its eyes, glinting faintly in the light, locked with mine for a brief, suffocating moment before it vanished. I stumbled back, heart hammering, and nearly fell over a broken chair. The instinct to flee surged, but something tethered me to the spot, a mix of terror and fascination. I realized with a sinking clarity that the forest wasn't just a backdrop. It was an active participant. It watched, it judged, it tested, and I was failing that test with every heartbeat. I retreated from the cabin, almost tripping over roots and rocks, and ran back to the Volkswagen. The air outside felt different, charged, almost electric. The shadows between the trees seemed to shift and stretch, anticipating my movement. I slid into the driver's seat and locked the doors, my hands trembling on the wheel. I told myself I was imagining things, that the symbols, the cabin, the figure, everything was a product of isolation and fear. Yet even as I started the engine, I could feel the forest's gaze pressing in through the glass, and heavy and unrelenting. Driving farther along Old Hollow Trail, I tried to focus on mundane tasks, scanning the road, noting landmarks, listening to the tires on gravel. But the forest's influence lingered. Branches scraped the sides of the van as I passed, each sound amplified in the tight confines of the vehicle. Once, I could have sworn a shadow moved in parallel with me outside the window, just beyond the reach of the headlights, keeping pace as though it knew where I was heading. By mid-afternoon, I encountered a small creek crossing. I parked and stepped out, needing to breathe and collect my thoughts. Water gurgled over stones, clear and cold. I knelt and touched it, letting the chill seep into my hands. For a moment, I closed my eyes and let myself simply exist, listening to the forest without fear, pretending for just a heartbeat that it wasn't an opponent, but a companion. Then I heard it again, a sound that made my stomach twist. A low, rolling growl echoed across the valley, vibrating against my ribcage. It wasn't close, but it was deliberate. I froze, scanning the tree line. Nothing. Just the wind, I told myself. Just the wind. But the hair on my arms stood straight, and a cold sweat broke across my forehead. The forest had spoken, and I hadn't understood its message. I spent the rest of the day hiking cautiously, staying on higher ground when I could, listening for any repetition of the sound. It came intermittently, never the same twice, like a conversation I couldn't translate. I thought about turning back, but curiosity, stubborn, dangerous, propelled me onward. Each bend in the trail seemed to twist reality slightly. Shadows stretched farther than they should, sounds echoed strangely, and every now and then I caught glimpses of movement at the edge of my vision. Night fell again, colder this time, heavier. I found a narrow clearing, just enough space to park the Volkswagen and pitch my small tarp. I lit a fire, more for courage than warmth. The crackling flames were a fragile defense against the pressing dark. Then, from somewhere deep in the woods, I heard it. A series of knocks, deliberate and rhythmic, like someone tapping on wood to get my attention. My pulse spiked, and I strained to see, scanning the tree line, my flashlight slicing through the black. Nothing moved. The knocks came again, a subtle pattern, almost conversational. I sat very still, trying to process what I was experiencing. Fear had evolved into something more complex. Awareness, respect, understanding. This wasn't random. Whatever or whoever was out there was aware. It watched. It communicated. And it had decided I was worth observing. Hours passed without further incident, though sleep was impossible. I stayed alert, listening to the subtle movements around me, noting the way the wind carried scents and sounds, how the shadows played tricks on my mind. The forest had become a teacher again, but one whose lessons were hard, unforgiving, and impossible to ignore. By dawn, I had an uneasy understanding. The figure in the cabin, the symbols, the noises, they were all part of the same story. A history of the backwoods that humans could only glimpse. I started the Volkswagen, driving slowly, scanning the forest, and for the first time, I felt less like prey and more like a participant. I had survived, yes, but survival wasn't the point. Understanding, paying attention, respecting the forest, that was what mattered. Even as I left Old Hollow Trail behind, I felt its gaze lingering, following me, reminding me that I had entered its world, that it had judged me, and that I had passed, but only just. The road stretched ahead, twisting and shining in the morning light. The Volkswagen carried me forward, steady and faithful. But I knew that the forest, with its whispers, its shadows, and its ancient inhabitants, had marked me in ways I wouldn't fully understand for a long time. By mid-morning, the forest seemed calmer, almost deceptively peaceful. I parked the Volkswagen near a small ridge where the trees thinned and the valley stretched below like a hidden cathedral of green. The sunlight pierced through in golden beams, illuminating swirls of mist that clung stubbornly to the slopes. For a moment, I allowed myself to breathe fully, thinking perhaps the worst of it was behind me. But as I stepped out and looked around, I realized the forest had been holding its final lesson until now. I heard it first as a soft crackle like dry leaves underfoot, but then the sound shifted, elongated unnaturally. My stomach knotted, and I froze, listening. There, across the clearing, was the figure again. Not fleeting this time, not just a shadow. It stood tall, its limbs stretching in ways that felt almost impossible, the head tilting as if studying me with intelligence and curiosity rather than malice. Its eyes caught the sunlight, glowing faintly, and for the first time, I felt a strange, intimate connection with it, like it recognized me as someone who had truly seen it, acknowledged its existence. I wanted to run, to slam the Volkswagen doors and speed down the ridge, but something held me. A mix of fear, respect, and awe rooted me to the spot. This was no random encounter. This was a test, a moment designed to strip away pretense and reveal how I would respond under pressure when confronted by something entirely beyond my understanding. I remembered Harold's words from earlier. Watch, listen, respect. Every instinct screamed at me to ignore the lesson, to flee, but I didn't. I simply watched, breathing slowly, keeping my movements minimal, allowing the presence to assess me. Minutes stretched like hours. Then, as abruptly as it had appeared, the figure receded into the trees, melting into the shadows. I exhaled, a long, shuddering release, feeling the tension drain from my body. I realized something profound in that moment. The forest hadn't sought to harm me. It had sought to test me, to challenge the limits of fear and curiosity, to force me to confront my own assumptions about what is real and what is imagined. I returned to the Volkswagen, hands trembling but steady, and allowed myself a small, almost incredulous smile. Fear, I understood now, was not something to escape from. It was something to engage with, to observe, to learn from. The forest, with its cryptid legends and whispering shadows, had become a mirror, reflecting the parts of myself that I had never truly confronted. Courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was the decision to act despite it, to move forward even when the world seems inexplicable and threatening. Driving back down the winding back roads, the Volkswagen seemed more alive than ever, responding intuitively to the curves and slopes, as though it shared in my revelation. I passed the remnants of the cabin, the old trail markers, and the creek that had offered me a brief reprieve, feeling a connection to every element of the journey. Each sound, each scent, each subtle movement of the forest carried a lesson. I had learned to trust my instincts, to respect the unknown, and to embrace the tension that comes with true solitude. By the time I reached the edge of the forest, where civilization began to reclaim the land in the form of paved roads and familiar rooftops, I felt transformed. The Volkswagen, once just a vehicle, had become a vessel of experience, a conduit between the ordinary and the extraordinary. I had faced something that defied rational explanation, and I had emerged not just unscathed, but enlightened in a way that stayed with me long after the engine's hum faded into memory. That night, in the comfort of a motel just beyond the forest's reach, I reflected on everything I had experienced. The fear, the unease, the cryptid encounters. They weren't merely obstacles or random threats. They were teachers. They had pushed me to observe, to respect, to question. They had reminded me that the world is larger, stranger, and more intricate than our routines and conveniences allow us to see. And I realized something essential about camping, about travel, about life itself. The greatest lessons are rarely comfortable. They arrive unannounced, in the dark, in the silence, in the moments when your mind races and your heart pounds. They teach you to confront fear, not merely to survive it, but to understand it, to integrate it, to allow it to sharpen your perception, deepen your empathy, and expand your courage. I thought back to the forest, to the figure, to the symbols in the cabin, and I smiled softly. I would return one day, I knew, perhaps to explore, perhaps simply to pay respects. But I would never forget that weekend, those back roads, and the lesson that the unknown is not always an enemy. Sometimes it is a guide. As I lay in bed that night, I could still hear the faint echoes of the forest in my mind. The whispers of leaves, the distant howl, the rhythmic taps on hollow wood. And in that sound, I found a strange, comforting truth. Fear, curiosity, and courage are intertwined. The Volkswagen had carried me through both the darkness and the revelation. I was not the same person who had entered those Appalachian backwoods. I was someone who had looked into the unknown and recognized that survival is only the beginning. Understanding, respect, and growth are the rewards. And so I drifted into sleep with the forest lingering in my thoughts, a silent companion and eternal teacher. I had unearthed something more than cryptids or legends that weekend. I had unearthed a deeper part of myself, one that listens, observes, and steps forward with courage, even when the path is uncertain, even when the dark stretches long and the wind whispers in ways that make your skin crawl. The road ahead is always uncertain, but after those Appalachian backroads, I knew I could face it. I knew that fear, when embraced and understood, is not a chain but a compass. And I knew that the Volkswagen, my steadfast companion, would carry me through every unknown stretch, every shadowed path, every whispering forest yet to come. The encounter had ended, but its impact had not. It would remain with me, quietly, persistently, shaping how I approach the world, how I respect the unseen, and how I honor the fragile boundary between curiosity and caution. The forest had taught me its oldest lesson: pay attention, respect the unknown, and step forward with courage. And that, more than anything else, is why I keep driving, why I keep exploring, why I keep camping along back roads that few dare to tread. Because somewhere in that darkness, somewhere in the whispering pines, there is always a story waiting to be unearthed. And I will always be ready to listen. I used to think the quiet was what saved me out there. That stillness of being alone miles from the nearest paved road, the hush that settles after twilight when the desert wind calms and the world feels like it's folding inward, making room for you. But the older I get, the more I begin to think the quiet wasn't a comfort at all. It was a warning I mistook for peace, because the things that frightened me the most didn't roar or crash through branches or call my name. They approached the way cold creeps into bone, slowly, invisibly, until suddenly you feel it everywhere. My name is Evan Hale. I'm 39 years old, and for most of my adult life, I've chased that thin edge between wilderness and solitude, thinking if I stayed out there long enough, the silence would carve me into someone more patient, more resilient, more unshakable. I wasn't running from anything. At least that's what I told myself. But every time I parked my old Volkswagen Westphalia in some forgotten pocket of the American West, I felt that same all swell in my chest, the one that told me I hadn't come here just to camp. I'd come here to disappear for a while, to let the world stop pressing against me. This particular trip was supposed to be a reset. Northern Arizona, public land, no official campground, just dirt roads and juniper trees and vast, unbroken horizons. I'd driven out there because the towns had begun to feel too loud, too close, too much like they were watching me. Out here, there were no neighbors, no headlights sweeping across windows at night, no footsteps from an apartment above mine. Just land, sky, and the subtle ticking of my van cooling down at sunset. I set up camp somewhere west of Highway 89, down a rutted path that seemed more like a suggestion than a road. The air was thin in a way that made each breath feel earned, and the temperature had that desert rhythm, hot enough to make you sweat by afternoon, cold enough to sting your cheeks by midnight. I liked it. It gave me something to adjust to, something to lean into. I parked the Volkswagen so its rear faced a slope of sandstone and scrub, thinking it off some shelter from the wind. I'd learned tricks like that growing up. My father taught me how to angle a vehicle, how to read terrain, how to watch the sky for shifts in weather. But what he didn't teach me, or maybe what nobody can teach, is what to do when the land itself starts treating you differently. Nothing strange happened that first day. I collected firewood, boiled coffee outside on my little stove, watched the sun paint the canyon edges gold. I felt that quiet unease, the kind that always comes on the first night of a trip, when your brain is still tuned to the rhythm of civilization, but your surroundings are whispering a different tempo. It wasn't fear, not yet, just the prickling sense that you're no longer insulated. Out here, your senses sharpen because they have to. The smallest sound means something again. It began with footsteps. not heavy ones, not the snapping of twigs or the crunch of gravel under boots. These were soft, deliberate, like bare feet on dust. At first, I figured it was an animal, maybe a fox, maybe a stray dog. But after a minute or two, the sound stopped feeling random. It felt like a pattern, a slow circle around the van, just beyond the reach of my lantern's glow. I remember standing completely still, one hand resting on the edge of the sliding door, listening so hard it felt like my ears were straining forward. The desert was windless that night, perfectly still, so every faint scuff in the dust might as well have been a shout. And every few steps I felt the sound pause, just a heartbeat of nothingness, and then resume as if the whatever it was deciding whether to get closer. I told myself it was my imagination, that I was on edge because I'd had a long drive, because I hadn't eaten enough, because the desert always felt like it stretched time in strange ways. But my instincts didn't believe any of that. My instincts were old, primal things, the kind that hum in your ribs when you're being watched. I kept the lantern low, not wanting to broadcast my presence any more than I already had. I whispered to myself something I'd said 1,000 times on other trips. Animals don't care about you. They have no reason to. But the words didn't settle me the way they used to. Instead, they made me realize something I hadn't considered. These footsteps weren't skittish or opportunistic or hungry. They were curious, and curiosity is a human thing. I didn't sleep much that night. I sat in the van with the curtains drawn and the stove off, listening to the desert breathe. Eventually, the footsteps faded, or maybe I convinced myself they did. Either way, I told myself I'd handled it well, stayed calm, stayed rational. I didn't let fear tell me a story that wasn't real. That's what I thought as the sky shifted pale with pre-dawn light. I'd faced the unknown, and nothing bad happened. Lesson learned. No harm done. But lessons don't come that easily. The next day, I hiked a little ways from camp, following a trail carved by time rather than people. The sand was packed tight underfoot, the sagebrush brittle between my fingers. I breathed deeper than I had in months, filling my lungs with clean, crisp air, the kind that tastes like distance from everything you thought you needed. I tried to let the previous night slip out of my mind, chalking it up to nerves. But halfway through the walk, I noticed something that made all my excuses collapse. There were footprints behind mine, not animal tracks, human. The soil was fine enough to capture shape, the heel, arch, toes, bare feet, narrow, long. And here was the worst part. They weren't following me from the campsite. They were leading toward it. In other words, these prints had already been circling the area before I arrived. I stood there staring at them, my pulse thudding in my neck, my thoughts firing in every direction at once. Maybe a hiker. Maybe someone else camping nearby. Maybe someone who'd passed by earlier that day. But the prints looked fresh. Too fresh. Sharp edges, no dust blown over them. And there were no tire tracks, no bike marks, no evidence of anyone approaching by road. Just feet. I crouched down to touch one of the prints, lightly tracing the edge. The earth was cool, the indentation crisp. Whoever had made it had done so recently, within hours, maybe minutes. For the first time on that trip, I understood that something wasn't right. And instead of packing up immediately like instinct told me to, I stood there rationalizing. Maybe someone was wandering off the trail. Maybe they lived off grid out here. Maybe. Every option felt possible until it suddenly didn't. Because as I followed the prints back toward camp, the pattern changed. The gentle curve around my van wasn't random at all. It was a deliberate ring, a perimeter walked slowly and repeatedly. The dust was disturbed in a full circle around the site, wide loops tightening as they approached the Volkswagen, like someone pacing while thinking, reconsidering, deciding. My stomach dropped. I felt that first real wave of dread roll through me, cold and deep, the kind you can't swallow back. Who circles an occupied van at night? Who walks barefoot in the desert? Who watches someone sleep without ever speaking? And why? The prints led straight toward the back of my van, right to the window where my head had been the night before. I didn't notice I was backing away until my heel hit a rock and nearly sent me stumbling. The desert air felt thinner all at once, like the land was sucking the breath from me. My fingers trembled as I reached into my pocket for my keys, but even though the van was still a dozen yards away, something had been right next to me last night, close enough to touch the metal, close enough to fog the glass with a breath, close enough to hear me shift in my sleeping bag, and I hadn't heard a thing. The thought rattled me because it meant whatever or whoever it was, they knew how to move silently, deliberately, soft as sand falling through fingers. I told myself I needed to leave. Right then. No second chances. But when I got back to the Volkswagen, I hesitated, staring at the keys in my hand. Leaving without answers felt almost as terrifying as staying. Something had chosen my camp, chosen to approach, chosen to watch, and I didn't understand why. That lack of understanding, that gap of meaning, was the wedge where fear grew. That's where things truly began. I stood there gripping the keys so tightly the grooves pressed into my palm, but I still couldn't make myself slide into the driver's seat. Not yet. My pulse was loud in my ears, too loud, like it didn't belong to my body anymore. I kept scanning the tree line, the slopes, the wash behind camp, anywhere that those bare footprints could have retreated to. But the land was still. That kind of stillness that doesn't feel peaceful, just hollow. Like the world was holding its breath, waiting for me to make the wrong move. I told myself to get inside the van, lock the doors, start the engine, drive back toward pavement, toward people, toward cell signal, toward anything that wasn't this. But before I could convince myself fully, I spotted something on the ground near the rear bumper, something I knew hadn't been there the night before. A single pebble. At least that's what I thought at first, but when I crouched down and touched it, I realized it wasn't a pebble at all. It was a piece of white sandstone, placed carefully, almost intentionally, directly beneath the window where my head had rested. Not tossed, not dropped, placed. The dread that hit me then wasn't loud. It didn't crash or explode. It seeped in, slow and steady, like water rising around my ankles. You don't notice the danger until movement becomes difficult. That's how fear was creeping in. I picked up the stone and turned it over between my fingers. No markings, no scratches, just stone. But its placement meant something. I just didn't know what. I finally climbed into the van, locking each door manually, checking the latches twice even though I'd done it 1,000 times on other trips. My hands shook as I started the engine. Dust curled behind me as I backed up, and for a moment I thought that was it, that I'd made my decision, that survival meant leaving and not looking back. But maybe it was ego, or the quiet desperation of a man who'd spent too much time alone, or maybe I just needed to understand what was happening. Whatever the reason, instead of driving away, I put the van back into park. I sat there listening to the soft purr of the engine, the low buzz of the old dashboard vibrations, those familiar sounds that usually grounded me. But nothing grounded me now. Not with that stone in my pocket. Not with the memory of those footprints circling me in the dark. I kept staring out the windshield at that ring in the sand, subtle but undeniable. A path walked not once or twice, but many times. If someone wanted to harm me, they'd had every opportunity. They could have broken a window. They could have pulled the door handle. They could have done anything. But they didn't. They watched. Why? That single question rooted me in place. I had to know. Not for bravery, not for pride, just for sanity. Because if I drove off not knowing who'd walked around my van, every shadow for the rest of my life would feel like a threat. Every campsite would be haunted by the possibility of someone standing just outside the tent or the van, watching. So I made myself do the thing I knew was wrong. I stepped out of the Volkswagen and started examining the prints more closely. The ring around the van was clear, but something else caught my attention. Beyond the circle, maybe 20, 30 feet out, another set of prints branched off toward a shallow ravine. Not returning footprints. Leading footprints, like someone had stood near my van for a long time, then turned and walked toward the ravine. Straight, sure-footed, purposeful. I followed. Not too close, not recklessly, just enough to see where they were heading. The ravine dipped gently, its sides carved by seasonal rain, its bed filled with loose red dust that recorded every disturbance clearly. And there, pressed into that soft dust, the footprints continued, still barefoot, still perfectly crisp. But then they stopped. Not faded, stopped, mid-step, as though the person had lifted their foot and simply never placed it back down. I stared at that final print until my eyes burned. This didn't feel like a warning anymore, or a threat. It felt like the earth itself had swallowed the tracks, or like the person had stepped into something I couldn't see. I backed away slowly, each footstep of mine loud in my own ears. The skin on my arms prickled, though the sun was warm and the air was still. I knew then that I couldn't stay another night. I walked briskly, too briskly, back to the van. Every few steps I looked behind me, even though I saw nothing but the empty horizon and the pin-drop silence of mid-morning desert light. When I reached the Volkswagen, I opened the door, climbed inside, and locked everything again. My hands shook as I shifted into drive. This time I didn't hesitate. I started down the dirt path I'd come in on, my tires bouncing over the uneven ground. The van rattled, dishes clinking inside the cabinets, the whole frame quivering with each rut and stone. I kept glancing into the rearview mirror, expecting to see someone standing in the road behind me. But the road stayed empty. After maybe 10 minutes of slow crawling, I told myself I was overreacting, that once I hit the highway, this would all dissolve into just another weird camp story. Something I'd tell someone one day and laugh about. Something I'd chalk up to nerves, isolation, the intensity of off-grid camping. I almost believed it. Until I rounded a bend in the dirt road and my engine sputtered, just once. A hiccup. Then again, longer this time, like someone briefly pinched the fuel line shut. "No," I whispered, tapping the gas gently. The van lurched forward, then died. The dashboard lights flickered, faded, then went dark. The engine coughed out one last breath and fell silent. I sat there in the sudden quiet, my heart pounding, my breath shallow. I'd filled the tank the day before. The battery was healthy. The alternator had never given me trouble. Everything had been fine, and the van had stalled on flat ground. I swallowed hard. My hands drifted toward the keys, but for several seconds I was afraid to touch them, because I knew in a way I didn't want to admit, that something else was happening. Something I couldn't explain. Something that wasn't mechanical. I finally forced myself to turn the key. The engine didn't even click. Didn't even try. Just silence. A silence so deep, it swallowed the air around me. I felt my throat tighten. My fingers trembled. The Volkswagen had always been reliable. Always. And now, suddenly, inexplicably, it wasn't responding at all. I tried again. Nothing. The desert sun hung steady overhead, bright and indifferent, but the world around me felt dim, strange, wrong. Like the rules I understood had begun shifting. Then, through that thick silence, I heard something. Not footsteps this time. Not circling. Not slow. A single tap. On the rear of the van, light, gentle, like a knuckle on metal. My breath hitched in my throat. I didn't move. Another tap, slightly higher, like someone testing the surface, seeking a response. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't accept what was happening. A third tap, this one dragging slideward like fingers gliding across the metal hatch. I didn't look. I couldn't. Because something in me knew that if I looked, the last thread of whatever sanity or logic I had left would snap. I just sat there, frozen, my hands still on the ignition. And then, as if responding to something unseen, the dashboard lights flickered back on, all at once. The engine roared to life. Not sputtering, not struggling. Instant. I slammed the van into gear and took off, tires spitting dust as the Volkswagen lunged forward. I didn't look back. Not once. Not even when the path straightened. Not even when the highway came into view like a lifeline stretched across the desert floor. I didn't breathe until I hit pavement, and even then it felt like something had followed me out of the dirt, something I wasn't supposed to see. Something that hadn't finished with me. The highway should have calmed me. It usually did. The hum of rubber on asphalt, the long ribbon of road stretching forward, the sense that civilization was slowly creeping back into reach. But that day, nothing settled. not the open sky, not the warm sunlight, not even the simple comfort of movement. I kept catching myself checking the mirrors, looking not for cars, but for something else. A shape in the road, a bare figure in the dust, anything that didn't belong. But the highway behind me was empty. Miles of straight, sun-bleached pavement, shimmering with heat waves, no traffic at all. There was something wrong with that emptiness, too, but I didn't have language for it, just instinct. I drove north for an hour before stopping at a gas station outside a small town. Winslow, I think. Or a town like it. The kind of place with a flickering sign, 2 dusty pumps, and a convenience store that smelled faintly of stale coffee and motor oil. My hands were still shaking as I pulled up beside a pump. I didn't even need gas. I just needed to stop, see other people, feel real again. But the place was oddly still. The windows were tinted dark from dust and sun fade, and I couldn't see inside. I tapped the pump handle once, twice, waiting for that beep, that click, the familiar starting whir. Nothing. I tried the door to the convenience store. Locked. I peered inside through the glass, cupping my hands around my eyes to shield the glare. No movement, no cashier, no customers. Just shelves and a counter and the faint outline of a turned-off TV. I knocked lightly. No response. At this point, my chest felt tight. I told myself it was all just bad timing. Maybe the cashier was in back. Maybe the store closed for lunch. Maybe everyone in this dusty corner of Arizona had stepped out at the same exact moment. But the silence felt wrong. Too much like the desert. I hurried back to the van, suddenly feeling exposed. Vulnerable. The sky seemed too open above me, the light too harsh, like everything was being watched from nowhere and everywhere at once. I climbed inside, locked the doors, and sat there for a moment, gripping the wheel. The Volkswagen was warm from the drive, heat radiating off the dashboard, but a chill threaded its way through my spine anyway. A strange disconnect between what my skin felt and what my nerves understood. Something was still following me, not literally, not footsteps or shadows or figures in the mirror. Something else. Something I'd brought with me the moment I stepped out of that campsite. The dread that had hovered around me wasn't staying in the desert where I left it. It was riding inside the van now, settling between my ribs, patient and quiet. I started driving again because the alternative was sitting still. And sitting still felt like an invitation I wasn't ready to offer. The next few hours blurred together. Small towns passing by, empty lots, quiet stretches of road where even the birds disappeared. I kept expecting something to break the spell. Traffic, noise, conversation, anything. But the world felt muted, like I was moving through a pocket of reality detached from everything else. By late afternoon, exhaustion hit me. I'd been running on fear since morning, and fear burns hot but drains fast. I needed rest, food, something grounding. So I pulled into a forest access road near Flagstaff. Pine country, cooler air, enough late-day light to feel safe. The ground was scattered with old needles, soft underfoot. The trees rose tall around me, trunks straight and dark, branches whispering in a breeze I couldn't feel. I parked the van in a small clearing, the kind meant for trailhead overflow, maybe 24 yards off the main access path. I told myself I'd only rest for an hour. 1 hour to breathe, to gather myself, to shake this heaviness. I didn't even lie down. I sat in the driver's seat reclined slightly, legs stretched, eyes half open. The engine ticked as it cooled. The scent of pine drifted through the cracked window. The world felt normal again, grounded. I started to think maybe the morning had scrambled my senses more than I realized. Maybe the fear had amplified every little oddity into something larger, stranger. Maybe I really had imagined more than I wanted to admit. I'd almost convinced myself of that when I heard it. A faint tapping. Not on the van this time. Not on metal. On glass. On the passenger side window. One tap. Light. Too light, really, as if whatever caused it had only brushed the surface. I stiffened. My breath locked in my throat. I turned slowly, so slowly my heart beat loud enough to fill the quiet. Nothing. Just the shaded clearing, the tall pine trunks, the filtered evening light. I waited. A breeze swept through the trees, stirring needles into a soft rustle, and then Tap, softer this time, like the fingertip of someone who wasn't sure they were allowed to knock. I felt my scalp tighten, my whole body went cold. I kept staring at the window, waiting for a face or a shape or a shadow, something to give the tapping form, but the glass stayed perfectly still. It took several seconds before I realized something important, something that made my stomach drop in a way no footsteps ever had. The tap wasn't coming from outside. It came from inside the window. You don't misunderstand that sound when you've lived in a van as long as I have. Inside knocks ring differently. They resonate. They feel too close because they are too close. I jerked upright, heart hammering so hard it hurt. My first instinct was to fling open the door and run, but that meant stepping into the forest, into the darker unknown. So I froze, scanning the van with frantic, darting eyes. No movement. No one hiding between the seats or behind the storage containers. Nobody crouched in the shadows, but the van felt wrong. Too tight. Too quiet. Something unseen pressing against the inside of my skin. I whispered, barely audible, "Who's here?" Silence. The kind that listens. I forced myself to lean forward and place my palm lightly against the inside of the passenger window. The glass was cool. Steady. Nothing pressed back. For a moment, I wondered if stress had finally broken something in me, if the morning's fear had pushed me over some edge I never saw coming. But then, just as I pulled my hand away, something else happened. A faint smear appeared on the glass, like the residue of fingers dragged lightly down the interior surface, oily, human, fresh. I recoiled so hard I hit the seat behind me. Panic surged, white hot, flooding my limbs with a primal instinct so strong I almost tore the keys trying to start the van. The engine caught. I reversed out of that clearing so fast, pine needles spat behind me like shrapnel. I didn't care where I went. I just needed distance, movement, noise. Anywhere but there. I sped down the access road, breath heaving, eyes burning. I didn't slow until I hit the main road, van rattling from the uneven ground I'd just torn across. Only when I reached the highway did I feel enough control to blink. That's when I saw something that sent a fresh spike of terror through me. A single white sandstone pebble, just like the one from the desert, sat quietly on the dashboard, placed gently, deliberately, as if someone had left it for me to find. But I had locked the van. Every door, every window, I never once left it unsecured. The pebble shouldn't have been there. Unless whatever had tapped the inside of the glass had never left the van at all. I didn't touch the pebble at first. I couldn't. It sat there on the dashboard like an accusation, like proof of something I couldn't articulate without sounding unstable, even to myself. The engine hummed beneath me, steady and normal, and yet the air inside the van felt heavy, thick enough that each breath had weight. My hands trembled on the wheel. Every instinct screamed at me to pull over and throw the stone as far as I could, but something deeper kept me frozen, because throwing it away wouldn't change the truth. It was already inside. Something had already been here. My mind raced backward through the last hour, how I'd locked every door, every window, how I'd never once stepped outside after parking. I replayed each detail, searching for a mistake, a crack, a forgotten latch. But no matter how many times I turned the memory over, it came back complete. Nothing had been unsecured, which meant something had entered anyway. My throat tightened. I forced myself to grip the wheel again, to breathe, to not give in to the suffocating dread crawling up my spine. I needed to stay rational. Fear doesn't help you think. But the thought that found me next wasn't rational at all. What if it never left the van back in the desert? The idea lodged itself in my mind like a splinter, small, nearly invisible, but impossible to ignore. My pulse thudded. The road ahead wavered slightly in the growing heat of late afternoon. The forest thinned behind me, replaced by wider stretches of open land. Nowhere to hide, nowhere to stop where I wouldn't be swallowed by silence again. I drove. Fast, but not recklessly. I couldn't afford reckless. Not now, not when whatever was happening was relying on my panic to push me into mistakes. I needed distance, people, noise, something to break the pattern that had been unfolding since the desert. I set my sights on the next real town. Not a gas station, Not a trailhead, a town. 20 minutes passed, maybe 30. The sun drooped lower. Shadows stretched across the road like fingers reaching for my tires. My nerves were wearing thin. Every tap of gravel under the chassis made me flinch. My brain kept listening for something inside the van, a shift in weight, a scrape, a breath that wasn't mine. But nothing came. That nothingness was its own kind of torture. Finally, signs for an upcoming town appeared. Pine Hollow, population small enough that it probably didn't even have its own billboard, but it had a main street, a grocery store, people. I didn't care what it had. It was civilization. I pulled into town just as dusk settled into the streets. Porch lights flickered on, one by one. Cars crept slowly through intersections. A couple walked their dog near a park. Normal life. Beautiful, ordinary life. I'd never been so relieved to see traffic lights. The parking lot of a small grocery store seemed like the right place to stop. Public, busy enough to feel safe, but quiet enough that I could gather myself. I parked under one of the tall lamps that buzzed faintly as moths circled its glow. I cut the engine and leaned back, letting the stillness in my chest unwind just a little. This was good. This was sane. The world felt real again. But that comfort didn't last longer than a single breath. Because as I glanced across the windshield, I saw something reflected faintly in the glass, something inside the van that hadn't been there when I pulled in. A shape. Not a full figure, not a person, just a smudge, a faint silhouette pressed into the fog on the inner surface of the rear window. A handprint. Small, elongated, fingers longer than they should have been. The kind of print you'd expect from someone dragging their hand down the window while watching you drive. I jerked around, heart slamming into my ribs, but the back of the van was empty. Just the storage area, the bedding, the curtains I'd tied open for visibility. No one there. No one hiding. No one sitting silently in the shadows. The handprint remained on the glass. And that's when I felt something I hadn't yet allowed myself to feel. I wasn't dealing with a person. Not a hiker, not someone living off-grid, not a stalker or a thief. This was something else. Something that didn't need doors or windows or locks. I grabbed the pebble off the dashboard without thinking. It felt warm in my hand, warmer than stone should have been, like it held heat from something alive. I dropped it instantly. It clattered to the floor mat with a soft thud, vanishing into the dimness near the pedals. My breathing turned shallow. Too fast, too loud. I had to get out of the van. Now. I shoved the door open and stepped into the cool evening air. The sudden noise of the parking lot, the hum of engines, the dull murmur of conversation, the clatter of shopping carts hit me like a wave of relief. People. Actual, living people. But even as I stood outside, the sense of being watched didn't leave me. It deepened. I looked through the windshield again, scanning every inch of the van. My eyes caught on the rear window. The handprint was gone. My stomach dropped. I backed away from the van, pulse racing. My legs felt weak, like fear had hollowed them out from the inside. Not here, I whispered. Not around people. Not this close. I didn't believe my own words. Whatever had followed me this far clearly didn't care about crowds. I needed help. Someone to talk to. Someone to anchor me in reality. I spotted a clerk outside gathering carts, a teenager with curly hair and a bored expression. I approached him, trying to keep my voice steady. Hey. Sorry, do you know if there's a mechanic nearby? My van's been acting weird. He nodded. Yeah, 2 blocks down, past the diner. There's a guy named Carl. Closes at 8, so if you hurry. Greg's. I walked back toward the van, but the dread wouldn't let up. I opened the door slowly, bracing myself for something to jump out, to move, to whisper, to breathe beside me. Nothing, just the interior of the van. But the air inside felt charged, like stepping into a room moments after a heated argument. Nothing visible, everything lingering. I started the engine. It responded instantly, like nothing had ever been wrong. Maybe checking in with a mechanic would help. Even if they found nothing, even if they thought I was paranoid, at least I'd hear a human voice tell me the van was sound. That something tangible was wrong with it, something explainable. The shop wasn't far. A single garage bay, tools scattered across benches, the smell of grease and diesel thick in the air. A fluorescent light buzzed overhead with an occasional flicker that made the shadows twitch. Carl himself looked like he'd been pulled straight from a different era. Late 50s, beard grayer at the chin, denim shirt worn soft with time. "What can I do for you?" he asked as I pulled in. "Engine trouble," I said, "and electrical issues, maybe." I knew how weak that sounded, how incomplete, but I couldn't tell him the whole truth, not without sounding unhinged. He nodded once, took the keys, and told me to wait inside. I sat on a cracked leather couch near the wall, listening to the clanks and clicks as he worked. 5 minutes passed. 10, 15. At minute 16, the garage fell silent. No tools, no footsteps, no sound. My chest tightened. I stood slowly, every nerve screaming at me not to go into the garage because I already knew what I'd find. I stepped through the doorway. Carl wasn't there. The tools lay where he'd left them. The hood was still up, but the mechanic himself, gone. No back door, no sound of footsteps, no fading silhouette, just gone. And sitting on the driver's seat, placed perfectly, deliberately, was another white sandstone pebble, this one larger, this one cracked down the middle, as if something inside it had been trying to get out. For a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't even breathe. That cracked pebble on the driver's seat might as well have been a detonator. It felt like the final confirmation of something I had sensed but refused to accept. Whatever followed me wasn't tied to a place. It was tied to me. Every part of me screamed to run, but where? Into the night? Through town? Into the open highway? No direction felt safer than the one behind me or ahead of me or anywhere at all. The terror wasn't just around me anymore. It had settled inside, like a second pulse. I took one step backward, then another, my shoes scraping the concrete of the mechanic's garage. The shadows around me felt deeper now, more alive, swallowing the corners of the room in a way that light couldn't chase away. My breath fogged in front of me even though the air wasn't cold. That's when I heard the first sound, a soft click. Not metal, not a tool falling. The sound of something tapping the undercarriage of the van from inside. My heart lurched into my throat. I staggered back until my shoulders hit the wall. I stood frozen, unable to swallow, staring at the Volkswagen like it might open its doors and spill something out. Tap from under the floorboard. Slow, calm, intentional. A third tap, slightly harder, echoed through the frame. My mouth went dry. My legs trembled. I wanted to scream for the mechanic, to call his name, to insist he answer me. But even before I opened my mouth, I knew he wouldn't. Because he wasn't here. Because whatever had taken him, whatever had moved silently enough to leave no sound of departure, was still deciding what to do next. I forced myself to move sideways toward the exit, eyes locked on the van. Each step felt like wading through ice water, my limbs sluggish, my skin prickling with the unmistakable sensation of being watched. When I reached the doorway, I paused, because the Volkswagen's interior light flickered on by itself. Soft at first, then brighter, illuminating the cracked pebble on the seat, illuminating the empty space beside it, illuminating the faint imprint of something leaning against the passenger side door from inside. A shape pressed into the fabric, not clear, not a human outline, something longer, narrower, like someone or something had curled inside the van, watching me the whole time. I stumbled out of the garage into the cool night air. The streetlights of Pine Hollow glowed warm, but they didn't comfort me. The town felt eerily quiet, the streets too empty. Even the wind seemed to have stopped, holding its breath as if waiting for me to make a choice. The fear inside me sharpened into something else. Resolve, maybe, or desperation, or the bone-deep instinct that tells you running won't save you, but knowing what you're running from might. I turned and walked back into the garage, slowly, deliberately, because fear had taught me something important. Running in the dark only ensures you trip. When I reached the van again, the interior light blinked once, then went out. The garage returned to dim, heavy silence. My hand drifted to the sliding door. My fingers hovered over the handle. A voice inside me whispered, "Don't. A deeper voice, older than fear, older than instinct, older than the part of me that still believed the world was predictable, whispered, "You have to." I pulled the door open. The smell hit me first. Not rot, not sweat, not anything human. It was the smell of stone after rain, of earth cracked open, of something old and untouched by light, something that shouldn't move because it had never needed to. My stomach twisted, but I forced myself to lean in, scanning the interior. Empty. No figures, no squatters, no animals, nothing. Until my eyes dropped to the floor. The cracked pebble had split further. The two halves lay slightly apart. And between them, dust, not normal dust. White dust, like the powder from inside a bone. My hands shook uncontrollably. I backed away, gripping the edge of the doorframe to steady myself. And then from the shadowed corner near the footwell, I saw it. A mark, scratched into the metal floor with something sharp. A simple shape, a circle, a ring, just like the one walked around my van in the desert, except this one had a single line carved straight through the center. A path, a direction, a choice. I stood there, heart pounding, mind reeling, trying to piece together what the symbol meant, what the thing wanted, why it had followed me, what it was trying to communicate. But the more I stared at the mark, the more it felt like it wasn't meant to be understood logically. It wasn't a message. It was a presence, a reminder, a claim. My legs gave out for a second and I steadied myself against the door. I needed to leave this town. I needed to leave this garage. I needed to get somewhere open, somewhere with sky and wind and distance. The van was no longer safe, but it was the only way I could get anywhere. I climbed inside, careful not to touch the dust or the cracked pebble. My hands hovered over the steering wheel, and I braced myself for the engine not to start, for the light to go out, for the tapping to begin again. But when I turned the key, the van sprang to life instantly, too instantly, like it had been waiting. I backed out of the garage, headlights sweeping across the empty lot. I didn't look for Carl anymore. I knew I wouldn't find him. Something had taken him silently, like it moved through walls and matter effortlessly. The moment I hit the main road, I felt it. Not a noise, not a tap, a shift. In the rear of the van, a subtle weight change. Like someone settling in, like something acknowledging the movement forward. My chest tightened. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I couldn't. Instead, I focused on the road, on the white lines sweeping under me, on the sound of the engine, on the illusion of control. The town faded behind me, the streetlights dwindled, the night swallowed the edges of everything until there was nothing left but the hum of tires and the faint whisper of wind through the cracked window. For a long time I drove like that, refusing to acknowledge the faint sensation that something in the back of the van was listening, breathing, waiting. Only when I reached a wide pull-off overlooking a vast stretch of open desert did I finally stop. The land below was dark, a patchwork of shadow and starlight, the horizon barely visible. I turned off the engine. Silence rushed in, deep, endless. Something shifted behind me again. Not threatening, not approaching, just present. I stared straight ahead, afraid to turn around, afraid to move. The air inside the van felt heavy, like a pressure building, like the moment before lightning strikes. Then, slowly, something happened. The rear of the van grew colder. A soft chill spread forward, brushing the back of my neck, prickling my arms. Not ice cold. Not the cold of weather. The cold of distance, of something ancient, of something stepping closer without ever moving. My breath fogged. Then a sound, so faint I almost missed it, drifted through the van, the whisper of sand sliding across stone, and a voice so soft it wasn't even a voice formed inside my mind. Stay. A single word, not a threat, a request, a command, a truth. I squeezed the steering wheel so hard my knuckles whitened. Tears stung my eyes, not from fear, not entirely, but from the crushing weight of the moment. I felt stripped open, exposed, like the desert itself was staring through me. For the first time since all of this began, I spoke into the silence. What do you want? The air shifted again, and the voice, not sound but sensation, answered, You stepped into my circle. You entered my path. Now you carry it. The cold deepened. The van creaked lightly under the change in pressure. I closed my eyes, and the moment I did, the image of the carved circle flashed behind my eyelids. Sharp, clear, burning with meaning I still couldn't decipher. But the truth settled over me, undeniable. This wasn't something I could escape. It was something I had awakened, and something that had chosen me. The cold inside the van thickened, not by degrees, but by presence, as if the air itself had learned to listen. The desert outside lay silent and vast, waiting with the same stillness that pressed against my ribs. That presence, whatever it was, didn't move closer, didn't retreat. It lingered like a thought I couldn't unthink, a shadow I couldn't blink away. My eyes stayed closed because I knew that opening them would make everything real in a way I wasn't ready for. But the silence pushed at me, nudging me toward a truth I couldn't deny. I had stepped into its circle. I had ignored my instincts. I had overridden the soft, quiet warnings meant to save me. A trembling breath shook loose from my chest. "Why me?" I whispered. The question wasn't angry, just tired, deeply tired. The kind of tired that comes after weeks of pretending the world is rational. For a moment there was no response. Then the van seemed to exhale, a subtle groan of metal, a soft shift in the frame. The cold behind me steadied, then receded just enough for me to inhale without shuddering. The answer didn't come as a voice this time. It came as a memory, not mine. A desert at night, not this one, not exactly, under a moon that looked fuller, heavier. A circle drawn in the sand by hands that weren't hands. Something ancient stepping into it, a creature heavy with intention, tall enough to blot out the stars for a moment. It wasn't human, it wasn't animal, it wasn't definable with anything I understood. And around it, others watched, but never stepped forward, as if the circle marked something sacred or forbidden. Then the vision snapped. The van was silent again, except for my own harsh breaths. I forced my eyes open. The windshield was fogged from the inside, a stark contrast to the dry desert night outside. My reflection stared back at me, a ghost version of myself, eyes wide, face pale, jaw clenched tight. Behind that reflection, something moved in the corner of the glass. A shape, a ripple of darkness. I spun in the seat. Nothing. Just the back of the van, the faint outline of gear, and the open, hungry dark. My heart hammered. I needed air. I shoved the door open and stumbled out into the night. The sudden openness hit me like a shock. The valley stretched below, an ocean of shadow rolling toward the horizon. Stars glittered sharp and distant, cold and uncaring. The wind moved across the desert floor, lifting a whisper of sand that brushed against my legs like a warning, like a reminder. You stepped into my circle. My fingers curled into fists as I backed away from the van. The Volkswagen looked ordinary now, harmless, like any other vehicle left to rest on a cliff's edge. But I knew better. I knew too much now. That symbol carved into the floor, the dust, the pebble, the tapping, none of it had been random. None of it had been coincidence. You entered my path. A shiver ran through me as I realized the path might not be a trail or direction or route. It might be a burden, a mark, a tether. My body shook with a sudden wave of dread. Not from the cold, but from clarity. I hadn't been chosen. I'd been claimed. Behind me, the wind shifted. The air thickened. I turned slowly, breath held tight in my throat. A shape stood a few feet behind the van, not fully seen, not fully unseen. A tall silhouette, darker than the surrounding night. Humanoid only in outline, like the idea of a person rather than a person. Its edges shimmered faintly like heat rising from a road. But there was no heat. Only cold. The temperature dropped so fast my breath burst into fog. I froze. The presence didn't move toward me. It simply stood there, the distance between us feeling impossibly fragile, as if one step could collapse whatever thin thread held me upright. I swallowed hard, my voice barely forming. "What do you want from me?" The desert held the words. The shape didn't speak in sound. Instead, the wind rose suddenly, kicking sand across the ground in a circular pattern around the van. A perfect ring formed, just like the one I'd driven across. A ring that now enclosed both the van and the figure. My stomach turned as realization slammed into me. The circle wasn't a trap. It was a boundary, a doorway, a crossing. I had stepped through it once, and now it wanted me to step through again. I shook my head slowly, fear breaking into my voice before I could swallow it. No, no, I'm not going back in there. I'm not stepping into anything you draw. The wind died instantly. A pressure pulsed in my ears like a heartbeat. Mine or its, I couldn't tell. Then the presence shifted, not closer, not away. It simply changed direction, turned, if something like that could turn, toward the valley, and with one smooth, impossible motion, it stepped out of the circle and vanished, just gone, as if the night absorbed it without sound, without light, without trace. The cold left with it. I collapsed to my knees in the sand, gasping, my hands shaking violently. The silence that followed felt real again, natural, earthly, empty. The kind of silence that belongs to lonely deserts and tired travelers. Eventually I stood. My legs were unsteady, but I reached the van, placing a hand on the door as if grounding myself. The warmth returned to the metal slowly, like life returning to a numb limb. Inside, the white dust had vanished. The symbol in the floor was still there, carved deep, permanent. A memory, a warning, a truth. I brushed my hand across it. The metal felt warm now, natural. My own breath steadied, my heartbeat slowed. For the first time in days, I felt something like control return. But not safety, because I knew the truth now. I wasn't being hunted. I was being followed. Not in malice, not in hunger, but in expectation. When I finally drove away from that cliff, the dawn was breaking, a thin line of pale light creeping up the sky. The desert shifted from black to blue to soft, muted gold. The world returned to color. The wind warmed. The silence softened, and I felt it. Not behind me this time, not inside the van, but within myself. A thread, a connection, a path. One I didn't ask for, but couldn't refuse. Hours later, when I finally reached a small riverside campground miles away, I parked the van beneath old cottonwoods and stepped outside. The river murmured nearby, soft and steady. A bird called somewhere in the branches. A couple laughed in the distance over morning coffee. Life sounded normal. I leaned against the van, closing my eyes, letting the sunlight warm my face. Internally, though, the tension in me hadn't loosened. It had simply shifted. No longer panic, no longer dread, but something heavier. Something like responsibility. I spoke into the quiet morning, half to myself, half to the thing I wasn't sure could hear. If you're following me, I need to understand why. A breeze moved through the cottonwoods, rustling the leaves. Not answering, not threatening, just listening. And that was when I realized the final truth, the one I hadn't wanted to acknowledge. It hadn't chosen me. I had chosen it. When I stepped into that first circle in the desert, when I slept through the tapping, when I ignored the fear, every moment was a step deeper into something older, bigger, and colder than anything I'd ever known. My life wasn't about escaping anymore. It was about surviving the path I had awakened, and maybe, learning how to walk it without losing myself along the way. I climbed back into the van, closed the door softly behind me, and whispered a promise into the empty space. I'm not running anymore. The air in the van warmed as if acknowledging the shift inside me, and for the first time, I believed it. Whatever waited on this path, I wasn't facing it alone. I never imagined that a simple weekend trip in my old Volkswagen van could reshape the way I think about fear. The kind of fear that starts quietly, almost politely, whispering in the back of your mind, only to grow until it fills every corner of your senses. I pulled onto the gravel road that winds through the lower slopes of Mount Hood just as the late afternoon sun was breaking through the mist. Its rays scattered across the trees, fractured and trembling, as if the forest itself was hesitant to let me in. My van, a 1978 Westphalia I'd restored myself, felt impossibly small beneath the looming pines, yet impossibly alive. There was something about the way the fog hugged the mountain that day, something that seemed to watch, to anticipate, and I didn't notice it at first, not until later. I had invited a friend, Marcus, to join me. He was 34, a quiet guy with a deep respect for nature, the kind of person who reads the signs of the forest like Braille. Marcus had a knack for making the wilderness feel less intimidating, even when the wind sounded like whispers in a language I couldn't understand. We set up camp near Trillium Lake, the fog curling across its surface like smoke from some distant fire. The water reflected the mountain in distorted ripples, and every now and then, a shadow passed over the glassy surface that wasn't a bird or the occasional deer. I laughed it off, telling Marcus I was seeing things, but the unease had already begun to press at my chest, soft and insistent. As night fell, the forest grew denser, its sounds more articulate. The rhythmic drip of condensation from the canopy above the van sounded like steps circling around us, careful, measured. I tried to focus on practical tasks, setting up the small stove, laying out our sleeping bags, checking the van's locks. But the sound of the fog settling among the trees had a voice of its own, and I couldn't ignore it. I asked Marcus if he heard it too, but he just smiled, shaking his head, pretending to examine the stars that were slowly being swallowed by mist. By 10 o'clock, the fog had thickened into a wall. I couldn't see the lake anymore. The trees around the campsite became dark towers, swaying slightly in a wind I couldn't feel on my skin. I was grateful for the van then, its warmth, its smell of old vinyl and faint pine. Marcus was already inside, leaning back in the driver's seat, scrolling through his phone, trying to ignore the forest's pulse. I closed the sliding door and leaned against it, my eyes tracing the silhouettes of the trees that the fog had transformed into grotesque shapes. Something moved out there. I know it did. A rustle, a long drag across dead leaves, deliberate, patient. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer, maybe a coyote. But my stomach tightened, a cold, twisting coil that didn't loosen. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time stretched and contracted beneath that fog. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, the forest crept closer, pressing against the van's walls, as if it wanted me to see it. I heard knocking once, soft at first, then faster, more insistent. I froze, telling myself it was the van shifting in the cold. Then it came again, louder, rapping against the metal roof. My breath caught. Marcus muttered something, eyes still on the screen, not looking at me, and I realized he had heard it too. We stepped outside, flashlights cutting through the mist. The beam illuminated nothing but fog. The forest was still, eerily so, the silence punctuated only by that persistent tapping. We scanned the ground for footprints. Nothing. The mist clung to our clothes, heavy, wet, smelling faintly of soil and decay. I wondered if the fog itself was moving, curling around the trees and van, in patterns too purposeful to be random. Marcus and I exchanged looks, unspoken questions hanging between us. He suggested we head back inside, and we did, but the feeling didn't leave. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the van, every sigh of the wind through the pines made my heart hammer as if warning me. Morning came with muted light. The fog was thinning, sunlight struggling to pierce the haze. Everything looked normal, or at least it should have. We packed our minimal breakfast in silence, both of us skirting the edges of what we'd experienced, pretending to rationalize the night away. I drove slowly along the trail back toward the main road, feeling eyes on us from the tree line. I can't say if it was human or not, and perhaps it was better I didn't know. Every so often, the fog would shift unnaturally, revealing shapes that vanished when we blinked, like memories our minds refused to hold. We stopped at a small clearing to stretch our legs, and Marcus pointed to the forest floor. Something had been there. Marks, circular, deliberate, carved into the dirt and leaf litter, as if someone or something had dragged itself in patterns meant to be seen but not understood. I snapped a photo with my phone, though the fog made it nearly useless, a blur of gray. I felt a strange mixture of dread and awe. I couldn't explain it, and perhaps that was the point. The forest had marked us, or maybe it had only revealed itself to those willing to look closely, to question what was real. Driving away, the van's engine humming beneath me, I kept thinking about the fog, about how it remembered, how it had observed, how it had pressed into our sleep and thoughts. Marcus didn't speak much, only occasionally pointing out odd tree formations or the echo of something that sounded like footsteps. We were quiet, both of us processing what had happened in the way people do when they are too afraid to speak it aloud. The forest had shown us a side of itself that night, a subtle, intelligent presence, and it left us changed. That night, in the safety of a small cabin down the road, I journaled everything I could remember. Every sound, every smell, every detail that had brushed against my nerves. I realized the fear I had felt wasn't just fear. It was attentiveness. It was the mind awakening to the realization that nature has dimensions beyond our understanding, and that sometimes it tests you not to harm you, but to teach you respect. I wrote down Marcus's theories, my own observations, and the lesson that perhaps the most valuable moments on a camping trip are not the ones of comfort, but the ones that shake you to your core, that make you confront the fragile boundary between reality and imagination. The next evening, I couldn't resist returning to the edge of the forest. Something in me demanded it, not bravado, not curiosity exactly, but a need to confront what had brushed against us the night before. Marcus reluctantly agreed, though his usual calm was fraying at the edges. We parked the van at the same clearing near Trillium Lake. The fog had returned, thicker now, crawling along the water's surface like smoke that refused to rise. It smelled damp, of moss and wet bark, but there was something else, something metallic beneath it, faint and unsettling. We set up the van as if it were a fortress, Marcus inside tinkering with the small propane stove while I explored the perimeter with a flashlight. The beam cut through the fog in a thin, trembling cylinder, revealing glimpses of the forest floor, the trunks of trees, their bark slick and dark. Every shadow seemed to twitch as though it were alive. I noticed footprints again. Not human, at least not exactly. They were too long, elongated and irregular, and each step seemed to sink impossibly deep into the wet soil, as though whatever had made them was heavy but moved with an eerie grace. I felt my pulse accelerate. My mind tried to reason: deer tracks, fallen branches, illusion, but instinct screamed otherwise. The forest was watching, remembering, and I was part of its memory now. I called Marcus outside, and he reluctantly joined me, his flashlight shaking. For a long time, we stood in silence, listening to the fog breathe around us. Then came the sound, soft at first like fingernails dragging across the wooden side of the van. I froze, and Marcus's hand pressed lightly against my shoulder, grounding me, or perhaps warning me not to move. We moved closer to the van, hearts hammering, and the sound intensified, echoing off the metal roof, vibrating through the air. I tried to peer into the fog beyond the circle of light, but it was a wall, impenetrable and alive. Something shifted within it, too quick to be seen, but enough to make us stumble backward. Marcus whispered that we should leave, that we could come back another time when the forest was less attentive. I didn't argue. I felt the pull, the mental tug of the fog, a silent invitation to see what it wanted us to see. And then I heard it, a low, resonant hum vibrating through the ground itself. The hum carried a strange familiarity, like an old lullaby sung by someone just out of reach. I realized, with a shiver, that it was calling to me, or perhaps calling me out. Marcus was visibly shaking, whispering that it wasn't real, but I could see it. I could feel it. The forest wasn't passive. It wasn't just alive. It was sentient. And it remembered every camper, every footprint, every human arrogance that had dared to intrude upon it. We retreated into the van, doors locked, lights off. Inside, the sound persisted, muffled by metal but unmistakable. I pressed my face to the window, straining to see, to understand, but all that met my eyes was fog thickening into an impenetrable wall. Minutes stretched into hours. I counted each heartbeat, each tremor of the van's frame, each whisper of the wind through the pines. Somewhere, deep in the darkness, the forest was laughing, or mourning, or warning. I couldn't tell which. Sleep was impossible. Every shadow in the van seemed to twist when I looked away. Marcus muttered occasionally, half prayers, half rationalizations, trying to anchor himself in logic. I realized that my fear wasn't just about what was outside. It was about what we carry inside ourselves. Our denials, our impulses to dismiss intuition, our arrogance in believing we understand what surrounds us. The fog didn't only obscure the mountain, it revealed us to ourselves. By dawn, the fog began to lift, but the silence it left behind was heavier than the mist itself. The forest had receded, but its impression remained. We drove slowly back along the winding gravel road, eyes darting to every curve, every tree, as though expecting the shapes to rise and follow us. At a small overlook, I stopped the van and got out, compelled to touch the earth, to feel it under my fingers. There were markings, faint, circular impressions in the soil, surrounded by crushed pine needles, too organized to be random. I pressed my hand into one of them, cold, damp, and unyielding, and realized that the forest had recorded us, like an indelible ledger written in memory and mist. Later, in the safety of a lodge down the mountain, we spoke little. Marcus suggested we read, watch movies, distract ourselves, but my mind refused. I kept replaying every sound, every shift in the fog, the strange elongated footprints. It became clear that our weekend trip, which had begun as a simple escape, had transformed into a confrontation with something far older, far stranger than either of us could comprehend. The forest had a rhythm, a consciousness, and we had been uninvited participants in its nocturnal symphony. I couldn't stop thinking about the hum. Its resonance stayed with me long after we left Mount Hood. It wasn't fear in the conventional sense. It was awe, tempered with terror. It was the awareness that our actions, however small, are remembered by the natural world, by the forests and mountains that have stood longer than any human memory. That realization brought me back to the van, to the tiny vehicle that had carried us into the heart of the mountain's consciousness. It wasn't just transportation, it was our vessel into understanding, into reckoning with forces larger than ourselves. We returned to the campsite one last time a month later. The fog was thinner, the lake almost serene, reflecting the sun instead of hiding it. The forest seemed different now, less threatening, less immediate, but I knew better. The memory lingered, stored in every twisted root, every pine needle, every whisper of wind. I felt a deep, quiet gratitude for the lesson it had imparted, that fear, when faced, becomes understanding, that the forest, in all its quiet attentiveness, remembers everything, and through that memory, it teaches. As I packed the van for the final time, I looked back at Mount Hood, rising majestically through the clearing mist. The experience had left me changed, more aware, more respectful, more attuned to the subtle signs that the world around us offers. The Volkswagen, with its chipped paint and familiar vinyl smell, had been more than a camper. It had been a shield, a companion, a confessional for fears I hadn't known I carried. And I understood, finally, that the moments that scare us the most are often the moments that illuminate our deepest truths. The third night, I knew we couldn't avoid it any longer. Mount Hood was no longer just a backdrop. It was alive in a way that demanded acknowledgement. The fog rolled down the slopes like an old tide, curling into the trees and around the van, thicker than I'd ever seen. Marcus was quieter than usual, eyes darting to every shadow, fingers tightening around the edge of the folding chair he brought outside. I could feel his tension mingling with my own, amplifying it, creating a shared pulse of dread that made the forest almost palpable. We had planned to camp near the lake again, but instinct nudged me toward a higher clearing, where the mountain rose sharp and jagged against the night sky. As we climbed, the fog seemed to cling to our clothes, our hair, pressing against us like a living thing. Every footstep on the soft earth was muffled, swallowed by the mist, and every time I glanced back, the van below seemed to disappear into the haze entirely, as though it had never existed. The forest around us was quieter than before, almost expectant, waiting for something. At the top, we set up the van in the small clearing, the headlights cutting weak lines through the fog. I stepped outside to breathe the mountain air, and that's when I noticed the patterns in the snow-damp moss and soil, circular, spiraling, etched as if by hands that moved without hesitation. The designs pulsed with something I couldn't name, resonating with the hum I'd heard on our first night. It wasn't a sound anymore. It was a vibration that traveled through my bones, through the soles of my boots, into my very chest. The fog thickened around me, swirling in the beams of light, and I realized I could no longer distinguish what belonged to the forest and what belonged to my mind. Marcus whispered my name, voice quivering. I turned toward him and saw his face pale, eyes wide with a mix of fear and awe. Then it began. A figure, impossibly tall, emerging from the fog. It moved with a fluid, unnatural grace, neither human nor animal. Its limbs elongated and bent in ways that seemed both wrong and inevitable, its presence pressing against our consciousness. The forest behind it hummed in resonance, almost a chorus of memory and warning. My first instinct was to run, but my legs refused to obey, rooted to the earth by the same force that made the fog cling to our skin. The figure paused just at the edge of our light, and I understood with a clarity that bordered on terror that it was the forest itself, made manifest. It remembered every visitor, every footprint, every disturbance, and we were being examined, cataloged, judged. Marcus stammered that we should leave, that it was just a hallucination, but I saw the evidence of the forest's memory etched into the earth beneath us, and I knew it was real. The wind carried whispers, soft and unintelligible, brushing against my ears, brushing against my mind, a language older than any human history. We didn't flee, not immediately. We simply stood, the van behind us our only shield, and watched as the figure dissipated into the fog, leaving only the lingering vibration in the air. My heart pounded, but beneath it was a deep, steady calm, a sense that the forest wasn't malevolent. It was attentive, precise, patient. It demanded respect, demanded acknowledgement, and in that instant I understood the lesson it had been offering all along. Fear was a teacher, the fog a messenger, the mountain an eternal witness. When the sun finally began to rise, breaking through the mist in pale, fragmented rays, the forest softened. Shadows receded, and the patterns in the soil were less defined, but the memory of them remained with me. We packed the van, heavier now with the weight of understanding, but lighter with the clarity it brought. The drive down the mountain was quiet, each of us lost in thought, attuned to the subtle signals of the world around us. The crunch of gravel, the call of a distant bird, the whisper of the wind through the trees. Back in the safety of the valley, Marcus finally spoke, voice low, reverent. He said he would never forget it, that he had never felt a presence so alive, so aware, so unyielding. I nodded, knowing he meant the same as I did. The fog, the forest, Mount Hood itself. It had given us a glimpse of something vast and timeless, and through that glimpse we had learned to see ourselves more clearly. Not just our fears, but our resilience, our humility, our capacity for attention and respect. The Volkswagen van, faithful and worn, seemed to sigh as we loaded it for the last time. Its interior smelled faintly of pine, oil, and memories, a scent I would carry with me long after the tires left the gravel behind. I touched the dashboard, the steering wheel, the chipped edges of the door, and realized that the van had been our vessel, a small, human-scale bridge into a world far older and wiser than we could fully comprehend. That night, I wrote everything down, not as a story for anyone else, but as a record of what had been seen, what had been felt, what had been understood. Fear had been our guide, yes, but it was also our mirror. It revealed the edges of our courage, the depths of our intuition, and the necessity of respect for forces beyond our control. We had been tested, and though the forest had not harmed us, it had left marks deeper than any wound. A quiet, insistent awareness that life is larger, stranger, and far more alive than we often allow ourselves to perceive. Years later, I still think about that fog, that night, that mountain. The memory is not just fear, it is reverence, a reminder that even in the moments that scare us most, there is a lesson waiting to be understood. Every time I take the van out for a drive, I remember the pulse of the forest, the elongated footprints, the vibrations that ran through the ground beneath my feet. I remember Marcus, quiet and attentive, feeling the same resonance I did. And I know, as I always will, that the forest remembers us, as we must remember it, with care, with humility, and with a willingness to face our own shadows in the process. The Volkswagen remains my companion on every trip, a reminder that adventure is not just about escape. It is about confrontation, awareness, and the courage to feel deeply, even when the world presses against you with unseen eyes. Fear, when embraced and understood, becomes clarity. The fog, when noticed and respected, becomes a teacher. And Mount Hood, in its eternal patience, remains a guardian of memory, of lessons, and of the quiet, persistent truth that every step we take in nature leaves an imprint on the earth, on ourselves, and on the unseen eyes that watch, always. In the end, I learned that the scariest moments, the moments that make your heart hammer and your breath catch, are often the ones that shape you the most. The forest, the fog, the mountain, they are not enemies. They are reminders. Reminders that life is vast, mysterious, and demanding of respect. That even in solitude in the middle of nowhere, we are not alone. And that fear, far from being a weakness, is an invitation to see clearly, to act with intention, and to remember that every encounter, however strange or terrifying, carries a lesson meant only for those brave enough to perceive it. And so, when I drive through the winding roads in my van, fog curling around the headlights, I carry that night with me. The pulse of the forest, the whisper of the fog, the hum beneath my feet, they guide me, quietly, insistently, toward a life that is fuller, more aware, and infinitely more alive. Because fear, when met, remembered, and understood, is not the end of a story. It is the beginning of one that stays with you forever.